I died because of a banana. Not just one, because of the 40 kilograms that came crashing down on me. A cyclist flew out of the alley without a sound, without warning, without a chance. I managed to see a yellow cloud, and then I never managed to see anything else. The afterlife didn't come. A strange young body came, with pain in every joint. 16 years old, muscles, the smell of smoke and damp skin right in my nostrils. I lay on the ground, and the ground was cold and hard as stone beneath a layer of dirt. A gray sky hung over me, without a single cloud, only a heavy, gray emptiness. I did the first thing any sane person would do in a stranger's body. I closed my eyes and began taking inventory of what remained in my head from my past life. Everything was in place. Every book, every textbook, every documentary about primitive people. Fire from flint, snares made of intestines, tanning hides with urine. All of it lay intact in my mind. I opened my eyes and saw people staring at me as if I were a dead animal. There were about 30 of them, emaciated, gray faces beneath dirty, tangled hair down to their shoulders. Children hid behind the adults' backs, and the adults themselves looked like frightened children. One man stood closer than the others. Broad shoulders, scars on his chest, a fearless gaze. He said something in a language I didn't know, but I understood the tone immediately. He was asking who I was, or what I was. The difference in this tribe was negligible. I got to my feet slowly because the body wasn't fully mine yet. The man didn't back down. That was a good sign. Cowards don't become leaders. I scanned the camp behind him with a single glance, and that glance told me everything I needed to know. 3 animal hides stretched over poles instead of a roof. No fire, no food supplies visible from the outside. Children with swollen bellies, which meant one thing in every language of the living and the dead. Hunger. A long-standing hunger that had ceased to be acute and had simply become the backdrop of existence. I smiled, and the man tensed because a stranger's smile in his world never meant anything good. He didn't know that I wasn't looking at him. Through him, I saw the entire tribe at once as a single entity that needed to be saved. I raised my right hand, palm forward, a universal gesture. People aren't animals. They understand a pause. The man stopped. The others stopped with him because the herd instinct works in any age. I slowly dropped to one knee and picked up a dry branch about 30 centimeters long from the ground. Then I picked up a stone with a sharp edge from the ground and began working without saying a word. A sharp stone against soft wood. 4 minutes of work. Then I stood up and showed the result. A sharpened stake. Rough. Functional. The first weapon I had made in this world with the hands of this body. The man looked at the stake. Then he looked at me. Then back at the stake. I held out the stake to him, handle first. This, too, was a language that needed no translation. He took the stake, weighed it in his hand, said something to the 2 men behind him, briefly and firmly. They dispersed. That meant they wouldn't kill me right now. That was enough for a start. I looked around once more, methodically, like a surgeon before open-heart surgery. The forest was 100 meters away. The river was audible but not visible, meaning it was close, behind the trees. The wind from the north was cold. Winter is approaching, or perhaps it's already here. These people have nothing for winter except 3 skins and hope for spirits. Spirits won't help them. I knew that for sure because I'd just returned from there empty-handed. The scarred man watched as I surveyed the camp, and something new appeared in his gaze. Not fear, not trust. Something in between. Something like a predator's cautious curiosity toward an unfamiliar scent. My name was Choi Jinu in my past life. A middle manager, 38 years old. A banana. Here, I had no name. Not yet. A name would come when there was a reason to give one. I looked at the children with their swollen bellies and smiled quietly inside, where no one could see. They didn't know that tonight they would have a fire. I needed 3 things before nightfall: flint, tinder, time without strangers' hands that might interfere at the most crucial moment. I made a gesture to the scarred man that meant follow me and walked toward the river. He followed. The other 2 followed too, because a chief never goes anywhere in this world without a guard. The river turned out to be behind the trees, 40 paces away. shallow and fast-flowing with a rocky bottom. I knelt down right by the water and began sifting through the stones methodically, without rushing. I needed flint or pyrite. Flint is gray with sharp chips. Pyrite is golden with a metallic sheen. 3 minutes into the search, I found a fist-sized piece of flint with a good, sharp edge. The scarred man stood over the shower and said nothing. The guards stood a little further away and were silent too. This tribe knew how to keep quiet. It was the first sign that they could be turned into something serious. I returned to camp with the flint and immediately went to the hides hanging on stakes like a roof. I needed a dry inner surface of a hide that hadn't gotten wet from yesterday's or the day before's rain. I tore off a small piece from the inside of the oldest hide, where the fur had already fallen off. The scarred man said something sharply, and one guard stepped toward me. I didn't turn around. I kept working, because if you turn around, you admit that you've been stopped. The guard stopped on his own. Good. Then I went to the edge of the forest and found what I was looking for in 4 minutes. A tinder fungus. A hard, porous mushroom the size of a fist, growing on a dead birch trunk. It was dry on the outside. I broke off a piece and crumbled it between my fingers. Dry on the inside, too. I was in luck. I found some dry grass for kindling at the base of the same trunk, under the overhanging edge of the bark. I brought everything to the center of the camp, where the ground had been scorched into a circle about 1 meter in diameter. An old fire pit. They used to know how to build a fire back in the day. Then they forgot how, or lost the one who knew. The tribe gathered around in silence, all 30 of them. The children pushed their way to the front row, as children always do, everywhere. I laid out the tinder in the center of the fire pit. On top, I placed the dry grass loosely, without packing it down, so that air could flow from below. Then I took a flint and a piece of iron-rich stone that I had picked up by the river on my way back. The flint at a 45-degree angle. A sharp, gliding strike along the edge. The first spark. It missed. The second. The third. On the 6th strike, the tinder caught, and a red dot appeared inside the bundle. I leaned over and blew slowly and evenly, without rushing, because rushing kills the fire before it is even born. The red dot became a red spot. The smudge turned into a wisp of blue smoke. The smoke turned into a small orange petal. I placed grass on top, then twigs, then branches as thick as a finger. The fire took it all. 4 minutes later, a normal, steady fire about 40 centimeters high was burning in the center of the fire pit. The tribe was silent. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the silence of people witnessing a miracle. I sat in front of the fire, warming my hands, and didn't look at anyone, because looking at their reaction would mean waiting for approval. I didn't need their approval. I needed them to understand the difference between me and their spirits. Spirits never light a fire. They only promise it. The scarred man sat down next to me a minute later. Not across from me. Next to me. That was a language, too. He said something quietly. 1 syllable. Then he pointed to himself. I understood. A name. He had said his name. He said it again, more slowly. Something like, so. Maybe soy. Short and hard, like flint striking stone. I repeated it. So. He nodded. Then he pointed at me and waited. I called myself by the name this world had given me before I'd had a chance to come up with another. Chang. Just Chang. No last name, no history, no 40 kilograms of bananas. So repeated my name. He nodded again. Then he placed his hand over the fire. Close to the fire, not in the fire. He warmed his palm and looked as one looks at something that has returned after a long absence. I watched the children who were now reaching out for the warmth, and their faces were changing right before my eyes. The fear hadn't gone anywhere, but something else had appeared alongside the fear. The hunger hadn't gone anywhere either. The fire doesn't feed you. The fire only cooks food that isn't there yet. I smiled, and so noticed it, and didn't understand why I was smiling as I looked at the empty fire pit around the fire. He didn't know that I could already see the next step. The river 40 paces away. The stones on the bank were sharp and flat. Sharp stones plus thin branches plus the guts of the first animal we killed equals the first primitive fishing rod. In the morning. First, let the tribe just sleep in the warmth for one night. One night without the cold is something too. The forest crackled in the darkness. The fire held steady. The children fell asleep right by the fire, one after another like candles. I sat awake, thinking about the fish that now swam in the cold water 40 paces from here. Tomorrow it would become food. And the day after tomorrow, food would become a system. I got up before dawn, when the camp was still breathing evenly, and the fire had settled into steady embers. I needed an hour without an audience, because the first attempt is rarely a pretty sight. The river sounded different in the dark, deeper, colder, more real than during the day with witnesses. I crouched down by the bank and dipped my hand into the water. About 4 degrees, maybe less. Fish are sluggish in water like this. They huddle near the bottom in the bank where the current is weaker. That's good. Sluggish fish are fish you can catch without complicated gear on the first morning. I needed 3 things: a sharp stone, a thin, straight branch about 1 meter long, 30 minutes. I found a sharp stone in 4 minutes. The bank was rocky and bountiful. I cut the branch from a young ash tree using the sharp edge of the stone. 15 strikes, smooth, stiff enough. I sharpened the end of the branch with the same stone to an angle of about 20 degrees. A spear. The most primitive kind. Then I waded into the water up to my ankles and stopped because my body reacted before my mind did. 16 years old, not much fat. The cold pierced right through me in 3 seconds, like a needle through fabric. I remained standing. My body had no right to decide for me while the tribe had no food. The water near the shore was shallow, about 30 centimeters. The bottom was rocky with sparse patches of silt. I stood motionless for 2 minutes, staring down through the water without moving, holding my breath. In the 3rd minute, a fish appeared. One. About 25 centimeters long, a trout or something similar. It was swimming slowly along the shore, 10 centimeters from the bottom, straight toward me. I didn't move. Fish don't see stillness. Fish react to movement and to shadows from above. It swam past my right leg at arm's length, and I struck. The hook entered the water at an angle and dug into the bottom, and the fish swam away with the current, alive and unharmed. I pulled out the hook. I examined the tip. Too blunt. The angle was wrong. I went ashore and sharpened the tip for another 5 minutes. 10-degree angle. Almost like a needle. Then I went back in and waited again. A fish appeared 4 minutes later. A different one. Slightly smaller. This time I aimed not at the fish, but 3 centimeters below it, because water refracts light. The strike. The spear pierced the water, and I felt a different kind of resistance. Not the bottom. Alive. I pressed the tip against the rocks on the bottom, and with my other hand ran my hand down the shaft toward the catch. The fish was thrashing. I gripped it tightly with both hands, straightened up, and walked out onto the shore. The first fish of this world lay on the rocks, staring at the gray sky with no interest left. I smiled quietly, because I saw what the dead fish couldn't see. Behind me on the bank stood 4 people. So and 3 guards who had woken up when I left. They were watching. Of course they were watching. A stranger who lights a fire and disappears into the darkness doesn't inspire trust. So I looked at the fish, then at me, then back at the fish with an expression I was already beginning to read. That expression meant he was reevaluating his assessment, and he didn't particularly like what he was seeing. I showed him the knife. Then I pointed at the river. Then I pointed at the camp. Then I pointed at my mouth. Food, river, camp, eat. Sign language is primitive, but sufficient when the facts speak for themselves. He nodded. Once. Briefly. Then he said something to the guards, and they dispersed. Over the next 2 hours, before the camp was fully awake, I caught 6 more fish, 3 trout, 2 pike or something with a similar jaw, 1 fish I couldn't identify at all. Total, 7 fish. Total weight, about 4 kilograms. For 30 people, that's nothing. But it was a start, and I knew the difference between a start and a result better than this tribe knew the difference between hunger and satiety. I returned to camp with the fish strung on a branch, and the children were the first to see them, as is always the case. They didn't shout. They just stood there and watched. Their eyes were wide. Their bellies were still swollen. I placed the fish by the fire and gestured to So, indicating that I needed a knife or a sharp stone. A woman in her 30s stepped out from behind the others and handed me a flint chip without a word, without looking at me. I took it. I nodded. She stepped back into the crowd. It took 10 minutes to gut them. 7 fish. The guts to the side, but don't throw them away. I indicated this with a gesture. We need the guts. The guts will make fishing line for a proper rod. A rod will mean more fish. So watched as I set the guts aside, and a wordless question appeared in his eyes. I didn't answer. Let him see for himself. Explanations of that demonstration are religion. I needed science. The fish went onto the stones by the fire in flat pieces. The fat sizzled. The smell rose above the camp. The children stepped forward in unison, like a single organism divided into 30 parts. I needed one more. I picked up a gut and began to stretch it between my fingers, cleaning and stretching it. So came closer and watched as I wrapped the gut around a branch and dried it over the fire. Primitive fishing line. Dries in 20 minutes over a good fire. Holds up to 3 kilograms of weight. When the fish on the rocks was ready, I didn't distribute it myself. I placed the rocks in front of So. Let him distribute it. The authority remains with him. I need his cooperation, not his position. So understood. He was smart. Smart leaders always understand when they're being allowed to save face. He distributed the fish in silence, giving it first to the children, which also spoke volumes about him. I sat off to the side, eating my share and watching the fishing line dry over the coals. Tomorrow I'll have a proper fishing rod. The day after tomorrow, snares on the shore. In 3 days, a woven net. I smiled away from the fire, toward where no one was looking. They thought I'd fed them for today. They didn't know I was building a system for the next 30 years. The fishing line had dried overnight and become as stiff as an old deer's tendon. I worked it between my fingers, checking the tension. It holds. It doesn't snap. Good enough for a start. The hook was the next problem, because you can't make a hook out of nothing, even in the Stone Age. I needed a bone, hard enough, long enough, straight enough to serve as a blank. I walked over to the pile of scraps at the edge of the camp and found a bone from some animal there, the shin bone of a small beast, dry, solid, broken in half to get to the marrow. Sharpening a flint chip against bone is slow work, but not impossible with patience. 40 minutes. I chipped off a blank about 5 centimeters long and began shaping it against a flat stone. So sat 3 meters away and watched in silence. He had already stopped pretending not to be watching. This was progress. People who don't trust you watch surreptitiously. He watched openly. The bone hook took another hour. Rough, no barbs yet. But the shape is right, the angle is right. I tied the hook to the line with a triple knot that holds even when everything else has given way. The bait was the last task. Larvae under the bark of a dead tree. I found them in 7 minutes. White, plump, about 2 centimeters long. Fish love them more than anything else in cold water. So stood up when I went to the river and followed without invitation and without explanation. I didn't object. Let him see. Knowledge you see with your own eyes is remembered differently than knowledge you hear. The first bite came 3 minutes later. The line twitched and tightened, and I set the hook with a quick flick of my wrist. A trout about 30 centimeters long, plump. The autumn feeding hadn't quite finished yet, so let out a sound that needed no translation into any language spoken by living creatures on the planet. I pulled the fish out and showed So the rod in my hand. Then I pointed to the river. Then I handed the rod to him. He took it, carefully, the way you handle an unfamiliar object that might turn out to be dangerous. I showed him how to hold it, how to lower the line, how to wait, how to feel the tension through his fingers. So was a quick learner. That, too, said more about him than the scars on his chest and his steely gaze. 20 minutes later, he pulled out his first fish on his own and looked at it with the expression of a man who had just been told that the earth is round. I nodded. He nodded back. That was enough to understand each other without a single shared word. While So was getting the hang of the fishing rod, I went into the woods because fish are good, but you can't build a system on a single fish. I needed snares. Small game. Squirrels, rabbits, voles, anything that runs on the ground and weighs less than 5 kilograms. The material for the snares lay right at my feet. Young willow branches, flexible yet sturdy. I cut 12 branches about half a meter long and began weaving loops right by the animal's trail. I found the trail in 4 minutes. Trampled grass, droppings, fur on the lower branches of the bushes, rabbits or something similar. Judging by the tracks, there are plenty of them here. Judging by the state of the trail, they come here every night. A snare loop about 10 centimeters in diameter, height above the ground about 8 centimeters. This is important. Too high and the animal will pass under the loop. Too low and it will only catch its paw. 10 snares along the trail, spaced about 3 meters apart. The math is simple. If the trail is active and the snares are set correctly, by morning there will be 2 to 5 animals in them. 2 animals plus the morning's catch is a whole different story for a tribe that's used to eating once every 2 days. I was heading back to camp when I heard footsteps behind me. Not one person, several. I turned around. 3 men from the tribe, young, 18 to 20 years old. They were watching closely. Not hostile, curious. That was the difference I'd learned to see over the past day. One of them asked something and pointed to the woods I'd come from. The gesture was clear without translation. What were you doing out there? I went back to the nearest snare and showed them the loop. Then I pointed to the trail. Then I mimed an animal with my hands and mimed the loop snapping shut. All 3 watched. Then they exchanged glances. Then the tallest one reached out toward the loop. I caught his hand before he could touch it. Not roughly, firmly. He froze. I shook my head and made a wait gesture. Then I pointed to the sky and the ground and back at the snare. In the morning. The animal will come at night. If you touch the snare now, the animal will smell a human and won't come. The tall one withdrew his hand. He nodded. He said something briefly to the other 2. I showed them how to check the snares. Approach from downwind. Don't trample the trail. They listened. They really listened. Not out of politeness, but because hunger is the best teacher there is. I gave them names in my head because soon I would need to tell them apart somehow. The tall one became Lee. The stocky one with broad shoulders became Park. The third, the silent one, became Kim. I'll find out their real names later. For now, it's enough that they came on their own and stayed to listen. The 4 of us returned to camp, and So looked at me from the shore, where he was still holding his fishing rod. 4 fish lay at his feet. He was learning fast, just like I said. Very fast. I smiled, and So sensed something in that smile because he frowned ever so slightly. He didn't understand why I was smiling at the sight of 4 fish when the tribe needed 10 times that many. He didn't know that I wasn't seeing 4 fish. I was seeing a chief who had just become a fisherman. A fisherman who will teach 2 more tomorrow. Those 2 will teach 4 more. In a week, half the tribe will be fishing. These aren't just 4 fish by the shore. This is the beginning of a system that will feed them when I'm no longer around. At night, I lay by the fire, listening to the forest, and thought about how snares are good, but winter is different. Winter demands more food, more warmth, more shelter than 3 animal skins on poles overhead. I needed wood, lots of wood, stone axes, log walls, a roof of bark and poles. Construction. The next big step after food is always construction, because a well-fed person who's frozen to death is just a pretty corpse. I stared into the embers and counted the days until the first snow based on the condition of the leaves I'd seen in the forest. About 3 weeks, Maybe 4 if I'm lucky with the weather. Most likely 3. 3 weeks to build a shelter for 30 people from scratch with stone tools. I smiled quietly into the darkness. Harder than a quarterly report, but about as inevitable. The snares worked. 5 animals by dawn, 4 rabbits, and something resembling a partridge with a broken neck. Lee found them first because he reached the trail before me, and that was a good sign. Initiative in the Stone Age is as rare as initiative in any other age among any other people. I showed Lee how to remove the catch from the snare without damaging the hide. Hide isn't trash. Hide is material. He watched once. He did it himself on the second snare. His hands were precise and patient. Pak and Kim arrived 10 minutes later, and we checked all 10 snares together as a small team. 5 catches out of 10 snares. A 50% success rate on the first night is a good start. I set the snares again while the 3 watched, and this time they helped without being told. Pak held the branch. Kim passed it along. Lee tied the snare himself, and I only adjusted the angle. They didn't learn through words. They learned with their hands and eyes, just as all people did before the invention of words. We returned to camp, and I handed the catch to the woman with the flint knife whom I remembered from the day before. She took it without a word, just like yesterday. She worked quickly and skillfully. Her hands knew what to do without instruction. I watched as she butchered the first rabbit and realized that this woman knew how to do things I didn't need to teach her. I needed to teach them what they didn't know. Everything else they could do better than me. So I approached as the woman was cutting up the meat and said something brief to her. She replied with a single word and didn't look up from her work. So didn't repeat himself. He just walked away. This intrigued me. A leader who doesn't repeat orders is either a very confident or a very smart leader. Then I stopped thinking about So because I had 3 weeks and needed to think about the logs. I took a sharp stone and went into the forest and found what I was looking for in 15 minutes. Young pine trees about 15 centimeters in diameter, straight, without large branches on the first 2 meters. A stone axe is not an iron axe. You don't chop down a tree with such a tool. You chip away at it and break it. I spent about an hour in the forest and returned with 3 poles, each about 2 meters long. So watched as I dragged the poles through the camp, and a question appeared in his gaze that he didn't ask out loud. I laid the poles on the ground and began to demonstrate. 2 poles vertically into the ground, 1 horizontally on top. Then I made a wall out of thin air with my hands, then a roof. Then I gestured toward the whole tribe. A house. For everyone. Until the snow. So looked at the 3 poles on the ground, then at me, then at the poles again. Then he said one word loudly. Not to me, to the whole camp at once. People began to get up, slowly, with an effort that is harder for hungry bodies than for full ones. But they got up. Everyone who could stand on their feet. I chose a spot in 20 minutes, a small slope on the south side. Natural protection from the north wind by a 3-meter-high rock. The rock behind us is already 1 wall ready to go. 3 walls of logs instead of 4. That's a 25% saving in time and effort. I marked out the perimeter with my steps. 6 by 8 meters. 48 square meters for 30 people. Cramped. But warm. In the Stone Age, warmth is more important than space, just as oxygen is more important than comfort. Work began. The men went into the forest. The women whittled poles near the camp with sharp flints. Lee was working next to me, and I noticed that he wasn't looking at what I was doing right now, but at what would come next. That's a rare quality. Most people look 1 step ahead. Lee was looking 3 steps ahead. We dug the first posts by noon. 8 posts around the perimeter, about 40 centimeters deep. The top layer of soil was frozen, so we took turns chiseling with sharpened stakes to avoid having one person work on a single hole. Then came the horizontal crossbeams between the posts. Then the first layer of vertical poles, set close together. The wall grew slowly, 20 centimeters an hour. It was slow, and it was inevitable. By the evening of the first day, we had 3 walls about 1 meter high, an open top, and no roof. I stopped work an hour before dark because tired people make mistakes, and mistakes in construction mean injuries. So distributed the evening meal. Fish and rabbit meat. More than yesterday, not much, but noticeable. A woman with a flint knife approached me for the first time of her own accord. She said something and pointed at the walls, then made a gesture that could mean only one thing. Hurry. Snow. She sensed the weather better than I did from the foliage. I nodded. She nodded. She went back to the fire. On the second day, I changed the plan. Not everyone on the logs. Division of labor. The first law of productivity in any age. Lee and Park into the forest for materials. Kim and the two older men on the trimming. The women weaving the filling between the poles out of twigs and clay by the river. Clay plus dry grass is primitive adobe. It retains heat at least twice as well as bare wood. So walked between the groups, and I didn't interfere with his roots because a leader must see everything for himself. By the end of the second day, the walls stood 2 meters high. The roof remained the final task, and the roof was more complicated than the walls. Poles at an angle to the ridge, bark overlapping the poles like roof tiles, a layer of turf on top for insulation. It rained on the third day, cold rain, almost snowing. The woman with the knife turned out to be right. I gathered everyone under the unfinished roof, and we finished it from the bottom up as the first drops began to fall. The final layer of turf was laid in place just as the rain intensified into a downpour. We went inside, all 30 of us, cramped, dark. It smelled of damp wood and wet people, but dry. For the first time in a long while, a time I didn't know, but which was written on the faces outside. So stood at the entrance, watching the rain outside and the people inside, and remained silent for a long time. Then he said something. One sentence, quietly. Not to me, to himself or to his spirits. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the tone of a man who had just changed his mind about something important. I smiled into the darkness of the corner where no one was looking. They thought I had built them a shelter from the rain. They didn't know that I had built them their first lesson, that the world can be changed with one's own hands. That was more important than a house. Much more important. There were no food supplies. None at all. I realized this on the fourth morning when I counted everything stored in the shelter. Dried fish for 2 days. Rabbit meat for 1. Nothing that could be called a reserve. 30 people. Winter in 3 weeks, if the rain still falling outside was any indication. The math was simple and ruthless, like any math concerning survival. We needed meat. Lots of meat. Not rabbits or trout. Something large, weighing 100 kilograms or more. I stepped out of the shelter into the gray, wet dawn and headed into the forest alone, because reconnaissance isn't a group activity. I found the tracks 200 meters from the camp on soft ground by a stream flowing into the river. Hooves, split, about 10 centimeters wide. The depth of the impression suggested a weight of 150 to 200 kilograms. A deer. A large male, judging by the distance between the tracks. It had been here no more than 4 hours ago. I followed the tracks for about 300 meters and found what I was looking for, a clearing, about 30 meters in diameter, thick brush on 3 sides, a stream on the 4th side, a natural corral. Nature had already built the trap. All I had to do was add a 4th wall. I returned to camp and found So by the fire. I traced the trail with my hands. I indicated the weight with both palms facing down. Then I pointed to the clearing. Then I pointed to the enclosure. Then I pointed to all the tribe's hunters together. So listened. Then he stood up and went into the forest with me without a word, because words were unnecessary here. He saw the clearing and immediately saw what I had seen. Smart hunters think alike in any age. So called over 3 men, a tall man with a spear, Paka, another one whose name I didn't know, 5 of us in total, including me, enough for a drive hunt on a single deer if we did everything right. The 4th wall of the drive didn't need to be made of logs. We needed scent, human scent, along the stream. I soaked a few pieces of hide in the stream and hung them on branches across the only exit from the clearing. The deer will smell it and won't cross the stream. The deer will cross the clearing, to where we'll be waiting for it. Then I showed the positions. And the tall one with the spear on the left by the bushes. Pack and the nameless one on the right. I'll walk in the middle as the herder. I'll move from the stream to the clearing slowly and noisily. The deer will hear me from behind. It will smell the hides to the right and left across the stream. It will run forward into the clearing. In the clearing, 4 spears and 4 men are waiting for him, men who know what to do. So listen to the plan through my gestures and added his own. We understood each other 40% of the time, and that was enough. We spread out to our positions, and I stayed by the stream alone to wait. I waited 40 minutes. The rain stopped. The forest fell silent with that special kind of silence that only comes when a large animal is moving somewhere nearby. The deer emerged from the spruce grove on the left, a large one, antlers with 8 points. I estimated its weight at a minimum of 180 kilograms. It stood there, sniffing the air, and I waited until the wind rustled a branch to my right. The deer sensed me and leaped forward reflexively, just as any animal does when danger approaches from behind. Right into the clearing. Right where I had directed it with my scent, my position, and my patience. I ran after it, shouting loudly because the noise of the driver is part of the hunt, not a mistake. In the clearing, everything happened quickly. The moose saw the people. It turned. It saw me behind it. It stopped. 2 seconds of hesitation. That was enough. So I threw the spear first. It hit the shoulder blade. Not fatal, but the deer fell onto its front legs. Tall struck with the second spear in the neck. Then the third in the side. Nameless finished it off. It all took about 10 seconds from the first spear to the last. I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the deer and the 4 hunters, and smiled quietly. They had killed animals before me, too. But they killed by luck. Today they killed by system. The difference between luck and system is the difference between food today and food every day. The deer weighed 190 kilograms. I checked after butchering to see how much meat we'd get. About 100 kilograms of clean meat. For 30 people, that's 3 kilograms per person. With proper drying and storage, that would last 10 days. With moderate consumption, 2 weeks. The woman with the flint knife, whom I had mentally begun to call So Yinj, took charge of the butchering. She worked methodically and wasted nothing. She collected the blood and the scraped-out hide for cooking. She set the intestines aside. She set the bones aside. She set the tendons aside separately as a matter of course. I watched her and reconsidered my plans because she was already doing what I was about to explain. The tendons are bowstrings. The bones are tools and arrowheads. The intestines are fishing line and rope. She knew that. They weren't helpless. They were exhausted and demoralized. Those are different things. So approached me when So Yinji finished butchering and said something new. A few words. I didn't understand, but I realized it wasn't a question or an order. It was something like a statement of fact. He pointed at me, then at the deer, then at the shelter, then at the whole tribe with a gesture. Then he said one word and waited until I repeated it. I repeated it. He nodded. He said it again, slowly. It was the first word of their language that I had consciously learned. I didn't know its exact meaning, but from the context, the word meant roughly one of 2 things. Either the one who knows or the one who leads. In this language, as in most languages I knew, these 2 concepts were a single word. That evening, meat sizzled over the fire, and the tribe ate for the first time in a long while, a time I didn't know. I sat off to the side and counted what I had. A fire, shelter, a 2-week supply of meat. 3 young hunters who were learning. Then I counted what I didn't have. Salt for long-term meat preservation. Bows for hunting at a distance. A common language. Salt was the first problem. Without salt, the meat will spoil before it runs out. Without salt, winter will kill them with food they didn't have time to preserve. I smiled toward the fire. They thought the hunt had ended today in the clearing. They didn't know that the real hunt would begin tomorrow. For salt, for knowledge, for the words of their language. Salt isn't just a seasoning in the Stone Age. Salt is the difference between food that feeds you for a month and food that kills you in 3 days. I knew 3 ways to get salt without industry, without mines, without anything except what nature provides around us. The first way is seawater. There was no sea, so the first method was out of the question. The second method is salt outcrops, places where salt rises to the surface of the rock in white crystals. The third method is ash. Some plants accumulate salts in their tissues, and the ash from burning them produces an alkali similar to salt. I started with the third method because the ash was right in front of me by the fire, and there was no time to wait. Ferns. I remembered this even before dawn, as I lay by the dying embers and went over everything I knew about Stone Age plants. Ferns accumulate potassium and sodium in their leaves. Fern ash contains up to 8% potash, which can be used as a primitive salt substitute. Not ideal, but enough to make the meat last twice as long as it would without anything. I got up before the camp was fully awake and headed to the north slope, where the ferns grew thickest near the damp rocks. I gathered an armful, a big one, as much as one person could carry without a rope or a basket. A basket is the next task. For now, just an armful. I burned the ferns separately from the main fire on a flat rock and gathered the ashes carefully while they were still warm. Gray. Fine. It smells bitter and a little mineral-like. The right smell. Yinji approached before I could begin the next step and stopped 2 meters away, watching. I took a piece of venison from yesterday's butchering and began rubbing the ash into the surface of the meat methodically, just as salt is rubbed in any era, in any kitchen around the world. She understood immediately. Not after a minute, immediately. Her face changed briefly and sharply, just as the face of a person changes when they've just remembered something important. She said something and left, then returned 4 minutes later with a bunch of another plant that I didn't recognize right away. Broad leaves, fleshy, with a grayish coating on the surface, which in some halophytes indicates active salt secretion through the leaf tissue. I took a leaf and licked the surface and stopped. Salty. Not like potash, real sodium chloride, weakly concentrated but quite distinct on the tongue. She knew. She knew this plant and knew it was salty. She just didn't know why the meat needed it. I looked at her differently than I had before, and she noticed and didn't look away. We burned her plant along with the fern, and the ash turned a different color, lighter, almost white at the edges. The sodium concentration is higher, significantly higher than in the fern alone. By noon, we had about 200 grams of mixed ash with enough salt content to treat the entire supply of venison. We rubbed the meat and hung it on poles under the roof of the shelter, where it was dark and cold, and a steady current of air flowed through the cracks between the logs. 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if the cold intensifies. That should last until the first big hunt after the snow. While we worked, I listened. Inji named things, quietly, almost to herself. The way you name things you've grown so used to that the words come out on their own. Meat, fire, ash, hand, knife, stone. I repeated each word once, and she corrected my pronunciation without unnecessary explanations, simply repeating it correctly. By evening, I had about 30 words, and a grammar I was beginning to figure out from the order of these words in her quiet phrases. The verb in this language came at the end of the sentence, just like in the Korean in my past life, which was a strange coincidence. Or perhaps not a coincidence. Or maybe that's just how the human brain works, regardless of the era. So arrived when the meat was already hanging from the roof. He stopped at the entrance and stared for a long time in silence. Then he asked one word. I understood him. How long will it last? I answered in his language with the 3 words I'd learned today. Moon, maybe, 2. He looked at me a second longer than usual. Then he nodded and left. So Yindi said something under her breath, and I only caught half the meaning, but it was enough. She said that So had never spoken to a stranger with words before. I smiled quietly and continued weaving the first rough basket from willow twigs, because my hands had to work while my mind was working. The basket is needed to gather ferns. The ferns are needed for ash. The ash is needed for meat. The meat is needed for winter. Each thing leads to the next like links in a chain that I was building, link by link, in the right order. Lee appeared at the entrance as it was getting dark and brought something in his hands. He placed it on the ground in front of me without a word. 2 pieces of flint. Flat. Carefully selected. One was almost a perfect oval. I picked up the oval piece and examined it. The right kind of flint. The right chip on one edge. Almost a finished scraper. He found this himself, without being told. He was thinking about the next step, while I was thinking about salt. I looked at Lee and said his name as best I could in their language. He nodded. Then I said the word I'd learned today from So Young-ji, a word meaning good, or right, or just as it should be. He left. But he left differently than he'd come, his back straighter, his step firmer. I returned to the basket and to the words that were taking shape in my head into the first outlines of a foreign language. Tomorrow I need a bow. The day after tomorrow, the second hunt. In a week, my language will be good enough to explain things, not just show them. They thought I was looking for salt. They didn't know I was looking for a way to truly speak with them. Because food feeds the body for a month, language feeds the tribe for a generation. A bow is not a stick with a string. It is physics. Elasticity against tension, against the weight of the arrow, against the distance to the target. I spent the first hour of the morning in the forest alone, and I wasn't looking for just any tree. I was looking for the right tree. Yew, hazel, ash. Any of the 3 provided enough elasticity for a hunting bow at a range of up to 30 meters. Yew was the best choice. The outer sapwood of yew works in tension. The inner heartwood works in compression. A natural composite without a single seam. I found a yew on the eastern slope across the river. A young one, about 3 centimeters in diameter, straight for 2 meters without a single knot. I cut it at the base with a sharp flint. 40 strikes. Then another 20 to clean up the cut. The blank needs to dry. Ideally, 6 weeks. I didn't have 6 weeks, and that was a problem I had to solve, not work around. I split the blank along the grain into 2 pieces and chose the one where the grain ran straighter, without any twists. Raw wood bends worse than dry wood, but it bends. With careful work and the right bend, green yew will yield a working bow that will last long enough for the first few shots. Then it will dry in shape and get better. Or it will break. The odds are 50-50. I took those odds and started working, because 0 bows is worse than 1 bow with a 50% chance. Lee came over an hour later and sat down next to me without an invitation and without asking questions, just watching me work. I didn't shoo him away. I worked slower than I could so that every step was clearly visible. Trimming the bow's shoulders took the most time. I needed an even bend without any sharp transitions. A sharp transition is a future breaking point. In a bow, as in life, the weak spot is always where there's a sharp boundary. I checked the curve every 5 minutes. I bent the blank with my hands. I looked for where the wood resisted the most. Where the resistance was greater, I removed material with a sharp flint. Where it was less, I left it. Lee watched, and after 40 minutes, he reached out toward the blank with a gesture that meant, "May I?" I let him. He took the blank and bent it with his hands, feeling where the resistance was uneven. His fingers found the same spot mine had found. Without a hint, without an explanation. Good hands think for themselves. Lee had good hands. The bowstring was a separate task, so Yinjae had neatly set aside the deer tendons from yesterday's butchering, and they had already begun to dry. I twisted 3 tendons into a tight cord by rotating them counterclockwise. Then I twisted 2 such cords together clockwise. Counter-twisting. The strands tighten when pulled instead of unraveling. Simple mechanics that are at least 5,000 years old. The bowstring turned out to be about 90 centimeters long, enough for a bow with a draw length of 1 meter 20. I carved notches at the ends of the bow. I attached the bowstring. I drew it. The bow bent. It didn't break. The bowstring sang softly and evenly when I snapped my finger against it. Lee looked at this sound with an expression I've seen before on people's faces when they hear something that is both new and beautiful at the same time. The arrows were simpler than the bow, but required a different kind of precision, straightness, weight, fletching. I cut 8 straight hazel branches about 70 centimeters long and whittled them down to a uniform diameter of 8 millimeters. The tips were made of flint. I knew the technique for chipping it, but knowing and doing are two different things, and the first 3 tips came out crooked. The fourth one turned out right, triangular, about 3 centimeters long, razor sharp along one edge. I tied the string to the shaft using a diagonal wrap that prevents the tip from spinning upon impact. The fletching is made of bird feathers that Choi Jinu had collected. I don't know when or why, but she had collected them and kept them in a leather pouch. She came over when I started attaching the feathers, silently placed the pouch nearby, and walked away. I took 3 feathers. I split them lengthwise along the shaft. I attached them to the arrow's tail at a 120-degree angle to each other. The 8 arrows took the rest of the day. By evening, I had a bow and 8 arrows, and Lee, who hadn't left my side the whole time. I emerged from my hiding place at dusk and stood at the edge of the forest, 30 meters from the old trunk of a fallen birch tree. The first shot went 20 centimeters above the target. The bowstring cut into my unaccustomed fingers. The sight needed adjusting. Second shot, lower, closer. The third hit the trunk 10 centimeters to the left of center. Lee stood nearby, silent and watching. Then he held out his hand. I gave him the bow. He took it. He held it wrong at first, then corrected his grip himself, feeling the balance. He drew it back. He shot. The arrow flew high and to the right and vanished into the darkness of the forest. He wasn't embarrassed. He took a second arrow. He drew it back more slowly. He shot. The trunk of a birch tree. Not the center, but the trunk. With the first decent shot of his life. So came out of hiding when we shot the third time and stopped behind me, watching silently. I didn't turn around. I knew he was there. I heard his breathing and footsteps and was getting used to the sounds of this camp faster than I thought. When we were done, So walked over, took the bow from Lee's hands, and examined it in the last light of day. He said something to Lee. Lee replied. So nodded, handed the bow back to me, and said one word. I understood that word. I had learned it 3 days ago from So Yinj by the fire. Tomorrow. He meant hunting. He saw the bow and arrows and immediately thought of hunting because he thought like a hunter, not a spectator. I nodded. I replied with 2 words in his language. In the morning. Early. So went into hiding. Lee followed. I stayed alone at the edge of the forest and looked at the fallen birch tree with an arrow sticking out of its trunk. 30 meters. 1 working bow, 8 arrows. 1 apprentice who hit the mark with his first decent shot. In a week, Lee will have his own bow. In 2 weeks, Pak will. In a month, the tribe will have 5 bows and 5 people who know how to shoot. 5 bows is a different kind of hunt. Not a drive hunt for a single deer on a lucky day. Systematic, controlled, reproducible. I pulled up the collar of the fur I now wore constantly and looked up at the dark sky. The first stars, clear, cold. Not a single cloud, which meant frost by morning. I smiled into the darkness because frost is good for jerky under the shelter's roof. They thought I had made a weapon. They didn't know I had made a profession. A bow hunter is no longer just a man with a spear. He is a specialist. And specialists are the beginning of the division of labor, which is the beginning of everything else. The frost came during the night, and by dawn the ground had hardened so that my footsteps sounded different, drier, shorter, more distinct. I stood up in the darkness and checked my bow. The bowstring had tightened overnight due to the cold, which was good for range, but bad for accuracy on the first few shots. Lee was already standing at the entrance to the blind when I came out. He hadn't slept or had woken up before me. In any case, he was the right man for what I was planning. Pak arrived 3 minutes later. Then So, with the tall hunter whose name I now knew. Khan. Khan-san, judging by how So addressed him in full. 5 of us. The same group as on the deer drive hunt. So understood the value of a proven team better than many of the commanders I'd seen in my past life at corporate training sessions. I explained the plan with gestures and words, which were now sufficient for simple explanations. Not a drive hunt, something else. The bow has a range of 30 meters, and the beast won't smell us at that distance if we move correctly. So listened and nodded once, which meant he understood and agreed without further discussion. We walked north along the river against the wind because a tailwind means the scent reaches the animal's nose, and the scent reaching the animal's nose means a wasted day. Kong Sanu found the tracks. He crouched by the stream bank and pointed silently. A boar, a large one. Its hooves were deeply embedded in the frozen ground, indicating a weight of 120 kilograms or more. A boar is more dangerous than a deer. A boar doesn't always run away. A wounded boar attacks, and it attacks low and fast, and its tusks are longer than my fingers. I made a gesture to So that meant, be careful, then pointed to the bow, and then to the distance. Shoot from a distance. Don't get too close. Wait until it falls. So understood and relayed the gesture to Khan and Pak, and they both nodded with that serious look people have when they don't need the danger explained to them because they've already seen it with their own eyes. The boar was by a fallen tree 150 meters away from us when Khan Sonu spotted it first and crouched down, and we all crouched down after him like a single wave. It was rooting at the roots, looking for something under the frozen crust. That was good, because a beast preoccupied with food is a beast that's only half listening. We circled around downwind for 20 minutes, and with every step I put my toe down first, then my heel, which almost completely eliminated the crunching underfoot. Lee walked just like me without being told. Pak walked louder, and Kong Son touched his shoulder, and Pak corrected himself immediately. At 35 meters, I stopped and raised my hand, and everyone stopped. The wind blew steadily and coldly in our faces. The distance was right. The position was right. I slowly raised my bow, nocked an arrow, and drew the string to my cheekbone, just as I had taught myself 3 days ago by a birch trunk. The boar raised its head. It sensed something. Not us, something else. A bird or a squirrel, or simply an instinct that speaks louder than any knows. 1 second of stillness. That was enough. I aimed for the spot behind the shoulder blade where the lung and heart are separated only by ribs and intercostal muscles, which an arrow with a flint tip pierces effortlessly. The shot. The bowstring snapped against my wrist. The arrow flew with a soft rustle that sounded louder than it should have in the frosty air. The boar leaped away from the impact. It was instinct. The animal jumps from the pain before its brain has time to process what happened. The arrow was lodged in its side, not behind the shoulder blade, about 8 centimeters to the right. I missed because the bowstring was colder and stiffer than during practice. The boar turned around and I saw its fangs and the low position of its head, which meant only one thing: attack. So shouted a single word. Kong San-woo and Park stepped aside, because experienced hunters know you can't stand directly in the line of an attacking boar. The boar was coming at me because I was the one who had struck it, and the scent of pain and threat was wafting from me in the direction his nose had detected in a split second. I stepped to the left and down at the same time, dropped to one knee and fired a second arrow into its throat from below as it was already 5 meters away. Not a calculated shot, instinctive. My body did what it knew without the involvement of my mind, which couldn't keep up. The boar fell 2 steps after the second spear. Its front legs buckled first, and it slammed its snout into the frozen ground and rolled another 1.5 meters by inertia. Silence. Then breathing. My own breathing, which I hadn't heard for the last 20 seconds. So approached the boar first and poked it in the side with his spear, but the boar didn't react. So straightened up and said a single word over his shoulder. Dead. I knew that word. Kong Sanu looked at me with an expression I read as surprise mixed with something resembling respect. Pak looked at the boar and then at the arrow sticking out of its throat and said something to Lee quietly. Lee replied with 3 words and didn't look at the boar. He looked at me, and in his gaze was something I had seen once before. Not surprise, something else. As if he were memorizing every movement I made so he could repeat it exactly later. The boar weighed 130 kilograms. I checked after the butchering, which So Eun-ji took charge of again when we returned to camp. About 70 kilograms of lean meat. plus the fat, which is more valuable than meat in winter because fat is warmth from the inside that no campfire on the outside can replace. Soinji worked quickly, and I watched and noticed for the first time something I hadn't paid attention to before. She sorted the parts of the carcass by purpose without being told. Meat separately, fat separately, hide separately, bones with bones, offal to where the older women were already waiting for it. It was a system, her own system that had existed before me and worked perfectly. I sat down next to her and asked her in their language, briefly and with incorrect grammar but clearly, "Who taught you this?" She answered with one word, "Mother." Then she paused and added one more, "Dead." I didn't answer. Some words don't require an answer in any language or in any age. She continued working, and I watched her hands and thought that this woman held knowledge I didn't know and would never learn from books because no one had ever written that knowledge down. By evening, we had 70 kilograms of wild boar meat and fat that So-Inji was already rendering in a hollowed-out skull over the fire. I sat by the fire and cleaned arrows, thinking about a second bow for Lee and a third for Pak, and about how flint arrowheads took too much time. We needed a flint knapping technique that could be passed on, not just something to do myself, to pass it on so that Lee could do it himself and teach Pak, and Pak could teach the next person. Knowledge that lives in one person dies with them. Knowledge that is passed on lives on its own. I smiled into the fire, and So Youngji, who was sitting across from me, looked up and asked in a single word in their language, "Why?" I answered her in their language, with two sentences that came out clumsily and with incorrect endings, but she understood. I said I was thinking about how much they would know in 10 years. She looked at me for a long time. Then she returned her attention to the fat bubbling over the fire and asked nothing more. But I could see she was thinking about it, and thinking seriously. The morning began with the inventory I took every day at the same time, because order begins with counting what you have. 2 onions, 6 arrows left over from yesterday's hunt because I didn't find 2 of them in the forest, and they're gone for good. About 170 kilograms of meat in total, if you count the deer and the boar along with what was already drying under the roof. 31 people, because one of the young women gave birth last night, and So Yinj gave birth on her own, without my help or anyone else's. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was worried, because I was listening and thinking about how midwifery in the Stone Age is a distinct science that So Yinj knew better than any textbook. The baby was alive and loud, and in the Stone Age that was not a given, but a small miracle that happened in about half the cases. The mother named the baby with a single syllable that I didn't catch completely, but remembered as something like, me. A new person in the tribe meant one thing in practical terms: more mouths to feed in a few years, when me would start eating meat and fish instead of her mother's milk. I didn't write this down on paper, since there wasn't any, but in my head, where I kept a table I called Tribe Demographics and updated every day. 31 people, 8 children under 10, 6 teenagers, 12 adults of working age, 5 elders. The elders worried me the most because winter, with its cold and dampness, kills the elderly before it kills children, and that is a loss that cannot simply be crossed off the chart. The elders held knowledge that I hadn't yet managed to draw out and make part of the common heritage, but that was next week's task. Today was the task of the bows. I called Lee and Pak after breakfast and led them to a flat rock by the river that had become my workspace for anything requiring precision and a hard surface. I placed 3 pieces of flint and 1 piece of obsidian in front of them, which I had found yesterday half a kilometer from the camp at the point where dark rock emerged from the slope. Obsidian is better than flint for arrowheads. It flakes predictably. It cuts cleaner. It holds its edge longer. I took a striker made from a solid piece of river flint and demonstrated the basic flaking technique. Strike at a 30-degree angle to the surface of the stone, not in the center, along the edge. Controlled chipping, not shattering. Lee watched once. Then he took the striker and tried it. The blow was too strong, and the flint split in 2, useless. I didn't comment. I took a second piece and demonstrated again. Force isn't needed. What's needed is the point of contact and the angle. Lee tried a second time. Better. The chip was uneven but controlled. The stone remained intact. Pak watched Lee, and when it was his turn, he did what people do who learn from others' mistakes as well as their own. He struck more gently the first time, and his chip came out cleaner than Lee's. Lee noticed this and frowned, and the next time he struck more precisely. A competition without words. The best learning engine I knew from my past life worked the same way in any century. We worked for 3 hours. By the end of the third hour, Lee had 2 tips that I would have accepted as usable. Rougher than mine, but usable. Pak had 1 tip and 3 broken blanks, an anger that he held inside as tightly as one holds something precious. I showed Pak where he was going wrong. Not with words. I took his hand and positioned the stopper in his fingers at the correct angle, and he felt the difference through his fingers. He made the next cut himself, and the splinter came out clean, and Pak looked at the arrowhead in his hand with that expression I already knew and loved to see. Understanding that came through the hands rather than the head. It lasts longer. We started on the bows in the afternoon. I showed Lee how to select a blank in the forest, which branch to take, which to leave, how to check the straightness of the grain by the bark split. He listened and watched and asked questions with gestures when he didn't understand, and I answered with a mix of gestures and words. By the 10th day, our language of communication had become something of a hybrid between their language and my gestures, and this hybrid worked well enough for complex explanations. Pak found a suitable piece of wood himself while Lee and I were talking. He brought it over. He showed it to me. I examined it and nodded. The right choice. The grain was even, the diameter was suitable, and there was only 1 knot, far from the center. Trimming the bow's shoulders took the rest of the day. I worked nearby and answered questions, and by sunset, Lee had a finished blank that just needed to dry for 3 days by the fire. Pak's blank was half finished, which was also a good result for the first day. So I watched all this from a distance. I didn't approach, I didn't interfere, I just watched. I didn't realize what he was doing until evening, when he called 2 older men over and spoke with them at length and quietly by the far wall of the shelter. He wasn't just observing the training. He was thinking about how to integrate it into what already existed in the tribe, how to distribute these new skills among people he knows better than I do. A smart chief. A very smart chief. So Yendi brought me food in the evening and sat down next to me, which was new because before she always left after bringing it. She asked in their language, slowly and clearly, the way people ask when they want to be understood exactly. You're going to teach everyone this. Not a question, a statement with the intonation of a question. The difference is subtle, but important. I answered with 1 word. Yes. Then I added a few more in a mix of their language and gestures. Everyone who wants to learn. Everything I know. She was silent for a minute. Then she said something I didn't fully understand. Only the last word. The word meant why or for what purpose. She was asking about the motive, not the method. I thought for about 10 seconds because the answer required words I didn't yet have in their language, and because the answer was important, and an imprecise answer is worse than silence. Then I said, slowly and ungrammatically, but honestly, knowledge that dies with me is useless. The knowledge that remains after me is the only thing that makes sense. So Yinji stared at the fire for a long time after that. Then she stood up and left, saying nothing more. Lee came over after she left, sat down in her place, and held out his 2 arrowheads to me. I examined them by the light of the fire more closely than I had during the day. 1 was good. The second was very good. Better than my first arrowheads in this body on the 3rd day. I handed them back and said 1 word in their language. Yours. He took them, clenched them in his fist. Then he said something brief, and I only caught half the meaning. Something about tomorrow and the forest, and how he wanted to make the 3rd spearhead better than the 2nd. I smiled quietly, because it was a conversation I'd heard in a past life from 1 person once. That man became the best manager in the department 2 years later, and I predicted it in the very first week. Lee will become the tribe's best hunter. I could predict that right now with enough certainty to have no doubt. They thought I was teaching them to make arrowheads and bows. They didn't know I was teaching them to teach others. Because one good hunter is luck. 10 hunters who know how to teach is civilization. There were 5 of them, and I had hardly noticed them before because they didn't hunt or build or do anything visible from the outside. They sat by the fire. They ate less than the others. They spoke to one another quietly and briefly, as people do whose words have long since become precise through frequent use. I began with the oldest because the oldest in any tribe is a library that no one has thought to read aloud. A man. I estimated his age at 55 or 60, which in the Stone Age meant a man who had survived everything one could possibly survive and remained alive not by chance. A face covered in scars. His right hand held a spear, even when he sat, even when he slept, as if the hand had forgotten how to be without a weapon. So called him by a single word that sounded like Khan, and pronounced it with an intonation I hadn't heard in other names, a little softer, a little more cautious. I approached Khan in the morning and sat down next to him without an invitation and without weapons in my hands, which was important because empty hands are a language that needs no translation. He looked at me and was silent, and I was silent too, and we sat like that for about 3 minutes until he spoke first. He asked something long and complicated, and I understood about a third of it, but that third was enough. He asked how I knew what I knew. I answered honestly, using a mix of their language and gestures. I said that I remember much of what happened before I came here, and that I want to pass this knowledge on to the tribe while it still lives within me. The Khan listened. Then he said a single word that I knew. The word meant good or right. Then he began to speak, and he spoke at length, and I listened, catching the words and piecing them together, just as one pieces together a broken vessel from its shards, hoping to guess the shape of the whole. He spoke of winter, of what it is like here, of how, 2 winters ago, it was so severe that 3 members of the tribe did not wake up in the morning and were found already frozen stiff by the extinguished fire. 3 people, out of 30. That's a 10% loss in a single winter, from the cold. Not from hunger, from the cold. I thought about this while he spoke, reevaluating my priorities in my head the way you revise a plan when new information comes to light. The shelter we'd built was better than 3 animal skins on stakes, but I didn't know how much better. Khan knew this winter. I didn't. I asked him with a gesture and words, would the shelter we'd built be warm enough? Khan stood up and walked to the shelter, and I followed him. He examined the walls and the roof, felt the adobe between the logs, and peered under the roof from the inside. Then he pointed to the cracks between where the adobe was thin and through which the cold was already seeping on this relatively warm day. Bad. That's not enough. We need more adobe. We need a second layer all around the perimeter. I nodded. This was information I couldn't get from books because no book described this particular winter in this exact place. Khan knew this winter. It was his 30th or 40th winter in these parts, and each had left him with knowledge I couldn't have gained any other way. I spent the whole day with him. We walked around the camp and through the surrounding forest, and he pointed things out and named them, and I repeated and memorized. Plants that can be eaten in winter under the snow. I knew some of them, others I hadn't even suspected. The inner layer of young birch bark, bitter but nutritious. Khan showed me how to peel it off and how to chew it to get the most out of it. Pine needles, vitamin C, which isn't found in meat and without which people die slowly and inexplicably. Scurvy is the Stone Age. It's reality, not an abstraction. I committed this to memory in capital letters. Pine needles, every day, for everyone, especially children and the elderly. Juniper berries under the snow. Cattail roots by the river that don't freeze because the water retains heat. A certain kind of moss that yields less in winter but still yields. Han gave me knowledge that had accumulated over 60 years, and I took it in as one takes in water during a drought, greedily and without leaving a drop. Around noon, one of the older women came and sat down next to me without being invited and began adding to what Khan was saying. Her name was Jong Su-ah, judging by how Khan called her when he wanted to get her attention. She knew things Han didn't know. She knew about illnesses and the herbs to treat them, and what to do when a person stops eating or starts burning up with fever. I listened to Jong Su-ah and thought she would have been a good doctor in any era. Not because she knew medicine, because she knew how to observe and draw conclusions from her observations. She described the symptoms accurately. She described what helped and what didn't, and why, in her opinion, one thing worked and another didn't. It was a scientific method without a name. Observation, hypothesis, verification, conclusion. She had been doing this her whole life without knowing it was called science. Willow. Willow bark stripped in the spring contains salicin, which is a natural precursor to aspirin and reduces fever and pain. Jung Sua didn't know the word salicin, but she knew the bark and knew what it did. I asked her if she had a supply of bark for the winter. She showed me a leather bag stuffed tightly with strips of dry bark. The supply was small. I asked her to explain to me how to properly harvest it and when and how much was needed for one sick person. She explained patiently and precisely, and I realized she had been waiting for this question for a long time. She knew this knowledge was important, but didn't know whom to pass it on to because no one had asked. No one had asked. That was the most important thing I realized that day. Not because people were stupid, because there was no system for passing it on. Knowledge lived in people in isolation and died with them, because no one had built a bridge between those who knew and those who needed to learn. I was that bridge. That was my function here, more so than fire or the bow or the drive hunt. By evening, I knew more from Han and Chong Sua than I could absorb in a single day, and I began to think about how to make this knowledge common knowledge immediately. I needed a way to convey it without writing, without paper, with nothing but voice and memory and repetition. I found Lee by the fire that evening, sat down next to him, and began telling him about pine needles and scurvy in simple words in their language, using gestures where words fell short. Lee listened. Then he called over Pak. Pak called over 2 more. 10 minutes later, 8 people were sitting around the fire, listening to what I was saying. So came last and sat not in the center, but on the edge, listening the way people listen who already know part of what is being said, but want to make sure they know it correctly. I spoke for an hour, about pine needles, about willow bark, about cattail roots, about how to check for drafts in the shelter's walls by placing your palm over the cracks. Then I fell silent, and Khan, who had been sitting by the fire from the very beginning, said one sentence. I understood him completely for the first time that day, because, over the course of that day, the language had grown closer, to a distance one could walk, not just see from a mountain. Khan said, "He's saying what I knew, but didn't say, because no one asked me." I smiled into the fire because it was an acknowledgement worth more than any title in any age. They thought I was gathering their knowledge for myself. They didn't know that I was gathering it for them, for all of them. For me, who was born yesterday and who will live with this knowledge her whole life, never knowing that once it lived only in 2 old men by the fire and nearly died with them. The second layer of adobe took 2 days and cost the tribe 40 liters of clay from the river and the same amount of straw which they found on a marshy bank a kilometer from the camp. Khan walked along the walls and checked each section with his palm while the adobe was still wet, pointing out where it was too thin, where there were gaps, and where it needed to be redone. I did not supervise this work. Khan supervised it. I merely provided the materials and the laborers, and stepped aside because a wise person does not stand between experience and its application. So Yinj organized the collection of pine needles without my asking on the 3rd morning after our conversation by the fire. She simply went out in the morning with 3 teenagers and returned with armfuls of fresh pine needles, and began handing out a handful to everyone and showing them how to chew slowly so that the sap would go down their throats and not be spat out with the pulp. The children grimaced. The pine needles are bitter and resinous, and they taste like the forest after rain, if the forest had never touched your tongue. Yindi wouldn't let them spit it out, and the kids chewed with the look of people who'd been told it was necessary, but not why, and who accepted it on trust. Trust was a currency I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected to receive so quickly, and its presence changed the pace of everything. Willow bark became a separate project. I took Lee and Park and 2 teenagers, and we spent half a day on the riverbank where the willows grew thickest. Zhang Su-ah explained the harvesting technique to me. Not in spring when the bark comes off most easily. Now, in autumn. From young shoots, where the salicin concentration is higher than in old bark, and where peeling doesn't kill the tree. A young shoot. A circular cut at the base. A second cut 20 centimeters higher. A longitudinal cut between them. The bark comes off in one motion if you know the angle. Lee got the hang of it after the 3rd branch. Pak after the 5th. The teenagers after the 10th, and that was normal because learning speed depends on how many times you've already learned something new, not on natural intelligence. We gathered enough to triple Chonsua's supply, and she examined what we'd brought carefully, setting aside 3 bundles that had been picked incorrectly and taking the rest without comment. 3 bundles out of 28 were wrong. That was good accuracy for a first try. The frost came on the 14th day after I appeared in this body in this world. I remember it clearly because that morning I was checking the snares with Lee, and the first frost lay on the grass by the trail, crunching underfoot differently than just wet grass. Lee stopped and looked up at the sky and said one word. I knew that word. It's starting. The snares had caught 4 rabbits and a partridge, which was a good haul for a single morning, and we returned to camp quickly because the cold in still air is one thing, but the cold on the move with the wind is another. The shelter with a double layer of adobe held the heat noticeably better than without it. I checked with my hand from the inside against the coldest wall, which faced north. Slightly cool, not cold. Khan approved without words, simply nodding when he entered in the morning and sat by the fire without that tense posture I had seen in him before when he entered the drafty shelter. The food supplies for the day looked like this. 140 kilograms of dried meat under the roof in a cool corner. 12 rabbits from the past 4 days, salted with ash. Fish that we had dried for 3 days straight, once So had mastered the fishing rod enough to teach others. Cattail roots that So Yinj had gathered every morning by the river until the water froze over. Not enough. I knew this for sure because I counted every day and could calculate 3 months ahead. At our current rate of consumption, our supplies would last 6 weeks, maybe 7 if we cut back. Winter in these latitudes, with this climate, lasts from 12 to 16 weeks. The shortage was obvious, and the math left no room for optimism. I needed a big hunt. Not just 1 deer or 1 boar, something else. I thought about it for 3 days, and the answer I found was both obvious and risky, and required words I didn't yet have in their language. A mammoth. No. Mammoths were too dangerous for a tribe that was just beginning to understand what a system was. 1 misstep, and I'd lose half the hunters. A horse. A wild horse weighing 300 to 400 kilograms. There would be enough meat to last 2 months. Hunting a horse meant driving it toward a cliff or a body of water. There was no need for direct contact if done correctly. I found So in the evening and began to explain. It took me about 20 minutes of gestures, words, and drawings on the ground with a stick for him to fully understand the plan. He listened without interrupting, which was a sign of either complete incomprehension or complete attention, and I could see in his eyes that it was the latter. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he called for Khan. Khan listened to So's retelling. Then he looked at me and said a single sentence that I understood about 2/3 of. The meaning was something like this. We tried this once and lost a man. I nodded. I asked, how? Khan explained slowly, and I pieced the words together into meaning the way one gathers scattered stones into a pile. They were driving the horses toward the cliff. One horse didn't make it to the edge. It turned around and kicked the hunter who was standing too close to the edge of the drive line. The hunter fell. He couldn't get up. He died 2 days later. I listened and thought about exactly where the mistake was. And the mistake was obvious after the very first analysis. The drive line was too narrow. People were standing too close to the animal's path. When the horse turned, it turned toward the man because the other sides were blocked. A different corral layout was needed, wider, with room on the flanks, with people positioned behind natural cover rather than in open space. I drew a new diagram on the ground. Khan watched. So watched. Then Khan poked his finger at a single point on the diagram and said something. I understood. He pointed to the spot where, in his experience, horses turn most often during herding. That spot on my diagram was blocked by a boulder, which I had marked with a circle. Khan nodded. Once. That meant the diagram was correct. So he looked at the map again. Then he looked at Khan. Then at me. Then he said one word. Tomorrow, look for the spot. I smiled into the darkness behind So because it was the right answer, and because a week ago he would have said that word only if the idea had been his own. They thought I had come up with the horse hunt. They didn't know that I had come up with something more important. I had figured out how to get Khan and So to think about the hunt together, instead of Khan remembering death and So making a decision without experience. The memory of a mistake, plus new geometry, plus the leader's decision. 3 elements that are insufficient on their own. Together, they are sufficient. Outside, the frost was growing stronger, and the coals in the center of the shelter glowed steadily, and 31 people breathed around them with a warmth they hadn't had 2 weeks ago. In 3 days, there would be a hunt. In a week, there would be enough meat to last until spring. I lay by the fire and counted in my head, not calories, not kilograms. I counted the decisions the tribe had made on its own over the past 3 days without my direct involvement. So Yinji had started distributing pine needles on her own. Han was checking the walls by himself. Li was setting snares without being told. So had combined my plan with Han's memory without my asking. 4 independent decisions in 3 days. A week ago, there were none. This was more important than meat. It was more important than bows and arrows, shelters, and fire. The tribe was beginning to think systematically, and it was doing so on its own. Reconnaissance took all morning and part of the afternoon, and the 3 of us, me, So, and Han, returned with cold hands and precise knowledge of what was needed. Han found the spot, not me. I would have looked for a cliff drop to the river or a rocky ledge. Han found something better. A wide ravine between 2 gentle slopes, open on one side and surrounded by dense spruce on the other 3. A natural funnel into which the horses walk on their own when seeking shelter from the wind. The tracks were fresh. At least 3 horses, judging by the size of the hooves. 1 large, 2 smaller. Khan said a single word that meant herd, and held up 3 fingers, then added 2 more. 5 horses, maybe more. He had seen this herd before and knew they returned to this hollow when the north wind blew, because the spruce forest retained heat better than the open slope. The wind had been blowing from the north for 2 days now. That meant the horses were there now, or would return there by evening. I surveyed the ravine methodically. The entrance was about 20 meters wide. The slopes on either side were steep enough that a horse wouldn't go up there without a reason. The spruce forest in the depths was dense. The only way forward was through the entrance. That was exactly where I was looking. I needed a wall of noise and scent that would block the exit and drive the horses back into the depths of the ravine, where hunters with bows would be waiting. Not toward the cliff, not toward the water. Into the depths, where the spruce forest slows them down and the hunters shoot from the trees, not from the ground. From the trees. I thought it over again. A horse can't reach them from the trees. From the trees, the angle of the shot goes from top to bottom, into the withers or into the side behind the shoulder blade. The best spots, both of them. Han watched as I surveyed the fir trees deep in the ravine, and when I gestured for him to climb up, he looked for a second and then nodded as if he'd been thinking of it himself, but wasn't sure the others would agree. The next morning there were 9 of us: Li Pak, Kang Sun, and 3 men whom Sun had chosen himself. Han didn't hunt, but he came and stood at the entrance to the ravine because he knew these horses and knew when they would arrive. 3 of us now had bows. Me, Li, whose bow had dried by the fire for 3 days and had become stiff and precise; Kang Sanu, for whom I made a second bow in 2 evenings because he turned out to be a patient student and his hands were stronger than mine. 3 bows, 24 arrows between us, enough for 1 good shot each if everything goes right, and 3 for each of us if it goes wrong. We took our positions before dawn, because horses sense what has appeared in a familiar place if it appeared in the light, but do not sense what has always been there in the dark. I sat on a fir branch about 4 meters high and waited, and the cold crept up from below through the hide I had wrapped around my legs, having anticipated this. Li was in a neighboring fir tree 3 meters away. He sat motionless, as people do when patience is no longer an effort, but simply a way of being. A good hunter does not wait. He exists in anticipation. The horses came when the sky turned from black to gray. 5. Khan was right. The leader went first. Dark. Tall at the withers, about 140 centimeters, which meant a weight of about 350 kilograms. Behind him were 4 smaller horses. They entered the ravine calmly because they didn't sense us. The wind was blowing in our faces. We were motionless. We were part of the fir trees to their noses and their eyes. I waited until the lead horse had passed under my fir tree and stopped 10 meters away from me, sideways. The perfect position. Behind the shoulder blade, from top down, an angle of about 45 degrees. I pulled the bowstring back to my cheekbone, exhaled half the air, held my breath, and released. The arrow entered precisely behind the shoulder blade, and the leader leaped forward and spun around, and the remaining 4 horses erupted in panic simultaneously, just as everything that lives in a herd explodes when the leader falls. The panic spread deep into the ravine because the exit was blocked by 5 men with torches and shouts, standing exactly where I had positioned them the day before. Li fired from his fir tree. He hit his mark. Kang Sun fired twice, and the second shot was better than the first. The leader fell 30 meters away. His legs buckled, first the front ones, then the back ones, just as something very large collapses when the force holding it upright is gone. 2 more horses were darting about in the depths of the ravine between the fir trees and the shouts of the drivers, and Li took down one with a precise shot to the neck from a distance of about 15 meters. The 3rd horse ran off through the fir grove to the side. We didn't pursue it. 2 animals were a sufficient result for 1 morning. I climbed down from the spruce and walked over to the leader, stopping beside him and watching in silence. About 340 kilograms. I'll check exactly after butchering, but my eye has already learned to estimate weight by the yield of meat, and this beast had fed the tribe for a long time. So stood nearby and was silent too, and I didn't look at him but could feel how his breathing had changed. Not rapid, different, deeper, steadier, like the way people breathe after they've just let go of something heavy. Khan was the last to approach. He looked at the leader for a long time. Then he said something quietly, and I didn't catch all the words, but I understood that it wasn't meant for us. It was for the horse, or for whoever stood behind the horse according to his beliefs. I left the butchering to So Yin and the older women, and they came to the ravine with their tools an hour later when we sent Pak to fetch them. So In-ji examined both animals. Then she looked at me with an expression I had learned to read over the past 2 weeks. That expression meant she was tallying the supplies in her head, and she was satisfied with the result. The lead horse yielded about 180 kilograms of lean meat, plus fat, plus hide, plus bones, plus tendons, all of which were already raw materials in her hands before I had a chance to think about it. The second horse yielded about 110 kilograms. That's a total of about 290 kilograms of meat in a single morning. At a rate of 3 kilograms per person per day, That's 70 days worth of food for 31 people, counting only the horses. No fish, no rabbits, and no account of the supplies we already had. 70 days, plus what we already had. It'll last through the winter, with plenty to spare. I smiled, and Khan, who was standing nearby, saw that smile and asked with a single word, "Good." I replied with 2 words in their language, "Very good." He nodded. Then he said something I hadn't expected, and which I understood completely because the words were simple and spoken slowly and clearly, as one speaks what has long been on one's mind. He said, "You hunt differently than we do. You hunt like someone who has already seen what will happen." I smiled quietly because he was right, more right than he knew. I really had seen what would happen. I had seen it from another time, from another life, from a library I had brought with me into this world without permission and without explanation. They carried the meat to the camp all day. By evening, hanging from the roof of the shelter was more food than this tribe had ever seen at one time in its entire history. A history I didn't know, but could read on their faces. 31 people sat by the fire and ate, and were silent, with the kind of silence that comes only when everything that needed to be said has already been said by the very fact of what is happening. So sat by the fire and stared into it for a long time. Then he said my name, not as an address, as a statement. Chan. Then he said one sentence that I understood completely and remembered every word of. He said, "The spirits do not feed us. You feed us." I did not answer, because it was neither a question nor a request nor an accusation. It was a new truth that So had spoken aloud for the first time, and which now belonged to everyone sitting by that fire. They thought I had killed 2 horses. They did not know that I had killed something else. Something invisible and weightless, yet something that had kept them in fear longer than any beast. Fear of winter, which always wins. This winter will not win. The snow came on the 3rd day after the horse hunt and fell thick and fast right away, without warning, without a tentative first layer. In the morning, the ravine where we had hunted was white, and the horses' tracks had vanished under 20 centimeters of snow, just as everything that existed before the snow in these parts vanishes. The hunt was over for the coming weeks. I knew that. The tribe knew it better than I did. 31 people in a 6 by 8 meter shelter with a 2-month supply of food and nowhere to go. It was a new situation for them, and it demanded a new way of behaving, one that doesn't come naturally. Idleness in a confined space is poison. Slow, imperceptible. It starts with boredom and ends in conflict that destroys what has been built over months. I knew this from a past life where I managed teams of people locked in offices, and I knew that busy people don't quarrel because they don't have the time or energy for it. I needed a program for the whole winter, not hunting, not construction, something that could be done indoors by the fire with minimal materials. Language. I started the day after the first snowfall, and I didn't start with the adults. I started with the children. Children learn language differently than adults. They don't think about the rules. They simply repeat and memorize without the resistance that adults feel when new knowledge requires rethinking the old. 8 children, aged 3 to 10. I gathered them around the fire in the morning and started with something simple. I picked up an object, I named it in their language, I said the same word as I understood its pronunciation. Then I said it again differently, slower, more precisely. The children laughed at my pronunciation, and that was right, because laughter is memorization through emotion, and emotional memory lasts longer than dry facts. An hour later, I had another principle that I derived right in the process. The children corrected me more accurately than the adults, because children lack the politeness that prevents them from telling the truth about someone else's mistake. So Inji sat off to the side and listened, and on the 2nd day she came over, sat down next to me, and began helping with the pronunciation without being asked. She would say a word, I repeated it. She shook her head or nodded. The children watched this and began doing the same themselves, turning the session into a game where an adult learns from children, and it was the best learning model I could have come up with. On the third day, teenagers arrived. On the fourth day, half the tribe was sitting by the fire, and the session turned into something else. Not a lesson, not a game. Something in between that I didn't know the name of, but that worked. I was learning their language. They were teaching me their language. We were both teachers and students at the same time, and this equality broke down the barrier that exists between those who know and those who don't yet know. By the end of the first week of snow, I had about 300 words of their language and enough understanding of grammar to construct simple sentences without mistakes and complex sentences with mistakes that they understood. But I wanted more. I didn't want to understand just the words. I wanted to understand how they think, because language is not a list of words. Language is a structure of thought, and the structure of thought of this tribe differed from mine just as much as an axe differs from a scalpel. Both cut, in different ways, for different purposes. In their language, there was no future tense in the sense that it exists in the languages I knew. There was the present, and there was the past, and there was a third thing that I initially mistook for the future, but which turned out to be something else. This third tense signified intention, not what will be, what I intend to do. The difference is subtle but important. Intention is not a promise. Intention is a vector. It is a direction without a guarantee of result. I thought about this for 2 days and realized that this was not a flaw in the language. It was honesty built into the grammar. They didn't say, I will do. They said, I intend to do, every time. It was the language of people who knew that the world is not obligated to fulfill intentions. Khan spoke to me on the 5th day of snow. He really spoke. No gestures, no short words, long sentences that followed one after another like links in a chain. He was telling a story. I understood 70% and guessed the rest from his intonation and facial expressions. The story was about a winter 20 years ago when the tribe was larger, about 50 people, and a beast came, a big one. The Khan said a name I didn't know and gestured to indicate its size. About 2 meters tall at the withers, long fur, tusks, a woolly rhinoceros or a young mammoth. I didn't ask for details. The beast wasn't the point. The beast came to the camp at night. It destroyed the shelter. It killed 3 people. The tribe fled and spent 3 nights without a fire, without shelter, in the snow. After that winter, 32 people remained out of 50. 18 people. Hunger and cold took what the beast hadn't. I listened and didn't interrupt, and when Khan fell silent, I asked with a single word. Where? He pointed in a direction, northeast, about 2 kilometers from the camp by his gesture. I memorized that direction, not because I was going there immediately, because knowing where the danger lies is the first step toward ensuring it doesn't come again. After Khan's story, I spent 2 days thinking about protecting the camp. Not about hunting, about protection. The shelter's walls keep out the cold. They don't hold back a beast weighing several tons. We needed something on the outside, a perimeter, a warning, something that gives us time to wake up and react before the beast is inside. I explained the idea to Lee on the 7th day of snow, when we were sitting by the fire and I could already speak well enough to explain ideas, not just facts. Lee listened and then said something that improved my idea. He said that dry branches crack under a heavy beast differently than under a person, different in sound, different in volume. If laid out correctly, the sound would wake us before the beast got close. I looked at Lee and smiled quietly because he had just invented a primitive perimeter alarm without a single electronic component and without any prompting. We did it the next day. We laid dry branches along the perimeter around the hideout in a strip about 3 meters wide. The branches were intertwined so that one would pull the other when pressure was applied. Lee checked it himself. He walked along the perimeter as cautiously as a small animal, almost silently. Then he walked with weight behind him. I stepped down hard. The crunching sound was clearly audible inside the shelter. Yinji poked her head out of the shelter, looked at us, and said one word. The word meant good. That evening, I taught the language again, but now I taught differently. I told stories, not explanations, not rules. Stories about what we did and why, and what happened as a result. A story about horses, a story about fire, a story about the shaman and the crevices Khan found. They listened to their own stories in their own language, and in these stories, cause and effect were linked as clearly as a straight line between 2 points. This was new. In their oral tradition, which I was beginning to understand, stories described what had happened. My stories explained why it had happened that way and what it meant for the next time. Cause and effect thinking through narrative. The oldest way of learning I knew, and the most reliable. Khan listened to my stories with the expression of a man who recognizes a familiar melody in an unfamiliar rendition. On the 10th day of snow, So asked me something I hadn't expected. He asked a long and complicated question, and I asked him to repeat it slowly. He asked, "Are there other places where people live who know what you know?" I was silent for a long time. It was a question to which I had no simple answer in their language, and no simple answer at all. Then I answered honestly, with 2 words. I don't know. So nodded the way people nod at an answer they expected to hear exactly like that. He didn't ask anything else that evening. But I could see he was thinking about it, and that this thought was important to him in the sense that thoughts are important when they change the way you look at the world around you. Snow was falling outside and a fire was burning inside, and 31 people were alive and fed and protected better than 3 weeks ago by a measure that could not be quantified in any units except 1. They thought differently. Not as they had 3 weeks ago, with a slightly longer horizon, a slightly more precise connection between action and result. It was the most important catch of the entire winter, and it weighed nothing, and it could not be hung to dry under the roof, and yet it would feed them longer than any NEAT. Winter took its course, and the days grew shorter and darker, and the fire in the center of the shelter now burned almost continuously, because without it, the temperature dropped to the point where breathing became visible inside the shelter. I kept track of the firewood consumption separately from everything else, because firewood isn't food that visibly dwindles before your eyes. It's a slow, imperceptible drain that suddenly becomes a problem. Lee and Park went out for firewood every morning, rain or shine, and returned with armfuls, which was enough for the day with a small surplus, meaning there was virtually non-existent. I solved this problem through counting, and counting turned out to be the next big step that needed to be taken, because without counting, inventory management is intuition, and intuition lies precisely when the cost of a mistake is highest. They had no numbers, none at all. There was little, a lot, and a great deal, and that was enough for a life in which everything was at once, and nothing was kept for more than a day. Now things were kept. Now numbers were needed. I started with fingers because fingers are the first counting system of any civilization in any century, without exception. 10 fingers. 10 is the unit of the next order. A simple system that can be explained in a single evening and applied immediately without additional equipment. I spent the first evening making sure all the children knew the fingers from 1 to 10 in their language and in my sign language, which we used the first few days and which was now merely an additional tool rather than the primary one. The children mastered it in one evening, just as I had expected. The adults needed 2. Khan mastered it in 1 because the concepts of numbers were already in his head, just without names, and all I had to do was give them names. On the 3rd day, I began counting our supplies aloud together with the tribe. Meat under the roof. I took a piece and said 1. I took the next one and said 2. The children counted along with me. The adults listened, and some moved their lips, repeating after me. 27 pieces of dried horse meat. 13 pieces of venison. 9 pieces of wild boar meat. 49 pieces in total. I wrote this on the ground by the fire with sticks. Not letters, Little lines grouped in fives, because a group of five is a quick way to count that doesn't require starting over from the beginning every time. So he looked at the lines and asked what they were. I explained. He looked for another second and then took a stick and drew a line next to mine. One extra line. He grasped the principle faster than I expected and tested it immediately, the way you test a tool you want to take with you. Then I counted the people, out loud, by name. 31 people. I wrote it down with lines. I showed the ratio. 49 pieces of meat for 31 people. That meant about 1.5 pieces per person. 1 piece a day is a normal intake, taking into account the fish and rabbits from the snares that Pak checked every morning, even in the snow, because the animals follow their trails in any weather. 1.5 pieces a day per person was a supply for about 30 days if we counted only the meat stored under the roof. Taking into account the daily catch, the realistic time frame was about 45 days. According to Khan's estimate, winter would last another 60 days or so. A 15-day shortfall. Not a big one. Manageable with reasonable consumption. I explained this to So using numbers and lines, and he understood and didn't ask for clarification, which was a sign of understanding, not politeness, because these people didn't stay silent out of politeness when they didn't understand. So Yinji sat nearby and listened, and when I finished, she asked if she could take over the tally. I interpreted the word she used to mean keeping daily track of the supplies. I answered with one word, yes. The next morning she counted the meat herself and drew lines on a flat stone by the wall, which became her work surface. She recounted it. She checked it against yesterday's count. She noticed discrepancies and asked Khan who had taken the extra. Inventory control passed to her in a single day, and I didn't participate in that transition because there was no need. The numbers led to the next thing. When you keep track of things, you start thinking about ratios. How much firewood for a day's worth of heat? How much fish per rod per hour by the river under the ice? Under the ice. This was the next task I was mulling over alongside everything else. The river froze over on the 9th day of snow. Fishing from the shore was over. But the fish hadn't gone anywhere. They'd gone deeper and slowed down, and now they're there in slow schools near the bottom. Winter fishing. A hole in the ice. The line with the hook is lowered to the right depth. No movement, no noise. The fish comes on its own because the bait is right under its nose. The ice on the river was about 20 centimeters thick enough to support a person, thin enough to be broken through with a sharp stone in 15 minutes of work. I explained the idea to Lee that evening. He listened and watched the fire while I spoke, and when I finished, he asked one thing. How deep should the line be lowered? The right question. Is it even possible? Does it work? How exactly do we do it? He had already accepted that it worked and was thinking about the details. We went to the river the next morning, just the two of us, in what felt like the harshest frost of the entire winter, around minus 15 or 20 degrees. The skin on exposed areas started to hurt after 10 minutes. I wrapped my face in a fur, leaving only my eyes exposed, and Lee did the same without being told, because the cold explains things better than any words. I drilled the hole in 20 minutes. A sharp stake made of hard wood and vertical strikes without jerks so as not to crack the ice around it. A circle about 20 centimeters wide, enough for the line. Enough for a small fish. A fishing line with a hook and a larva that Lee found under the bark of a dead tree by the shore. Larvae are slow and cold in winter, but alive. We waited 12 minutes. The line twitched. I pulled out a small fish. Lee watched, then took the line in his hands and lowered it again. The second fish appeared 8 minutes later. He pulled it out himself. He looked at it silently for a second. Then he said one sentence in their language that I understood completely. The fish doesn't know there's ice above. I smiled quietly and said something to him in their language that I hadn't planned to say out loud, but I said it because it was true. I said, many don't know there's ice above them until they try to go out. Lee looked at me with the kind of expression people have when they hear a phrase that means more than the words in it. He didn't ask what I meant. He just took it in, and I could tell by the way his gaze shifted slightly, deeper, as if he'd stowed something away in a place where it wouldn't be lost. We returned with 8 fish in 2 hours, and that was better than nothing. It opened up winter fishing as a steady source that completely eliminated the 15-day shortage. That same evening, Inji recalculated the marks on the stone based on the new data and showed me the result. There were enough supplies to last until the end of winter, with about 10 days to spare. For the first time in the history of this tribe, a history I didn't know but could read in the relief in her eyes as she showed me that stone. For the first time, they knew for certain that they would survive the winter. They didn't hope, they didn't pray to the spirits, they knew. Through numbers, through the marks on the stone, through a count that doesn't lie. The Khan looked at the stone with the marks for a long time. Then he placed his finger on a group of 5 marks and spoke a word. The word was new. I hadn't heard it before. He said it again slowly and added a gesture that meant many small things together. He gave the group a name, his word for the 5. Spontaneously. Because the concept had taken shape in his mind and demanded a name. I stored that word in my memory alongside all the other words I collected every day. They thought I was teaching them to count. They didn't know that counting isn't the end point. Counting is the beginning of planning, the beginning of management, the beginning of understanding that the world is measurable and everything that is measurable is subject to change. Outside, the frost held fast, and the fire burned, and the lines on the stone spoke a truth the spirits never spoke. Farming does not begin in spring. It begins in winter, when there is time to think and no pressure of immediate survival that consumes all attention without a trace. I began by taking inventory of what already existed around the camp, because true agriculture does not import crops from other climates, but works with what grows on its own. The problem was that the snow had covered everything, and I couldn't go out and survey the surroundings as I would have in summer or fall. So I had Khan. I went to him in the morning with a flat stone and a piece of charcoal from the fire, which served as my chalk on this makeshift board, and asked him to draw what was growing around the camp. Han looked at the stone for a second. Then he took the ember and began to make marks. Not pretty, not precise, but understandable. He drew and named. I committed the words to memory and correlated them with what I had seen in the fall during those few weeks before the snow. Wild wheat. I wasn't sure if that was exactly what it was, but Khan's description matched up well enough. A short stalk, an ear with small grains. It grows on the open slopes south of the camp. Wild onions. I saw these myself. They grew in dense clumps along the riverbank. Onions aren't a grain, but they provide vitamins that are scarce in winter and needed in spring after a long period of eating only meat and pine needles. Wild lentils are something similar based on Khan's description. Pods, small, hard seeds, growing on the eastern edge of the forest. That was enough to start with. 3 crops that are already adapted to this climate, this soil, this amount of light and water. There was no need to invent anything. We just had to help nature do what it already does, but do it in the right place and in the right amount. I explained the idea of farming to Khan through a long conversation that took 2 evenings because the concept was new, not in terms of words, but in terms of thinking. He grasped the idea of collecting seeds quickly. It was simply an extension of what they were already doing, gathering food. Seeds are just small food that you don't eat right away, but put into the ground. He didn't understand right away why you'd put food in the ground when you could just eat it. I explained it using numbers he already knew. 1 seed produces a stalk. A stalk produces 20 seeds. 20 seeds produce 20 stalks. 20 stalks produce 400 seeds. 1 seed, after 2 seasons, becomes 400 seeds. Eat 1 seed today and you'll get 1. Plant 1 seed and in 2 seasons you'll get 400. Khan looked at the little lines I was drawing as I explained. 1 little line branching into 20, which branch into 400. He was silent for about 2 minutes. Then he said one word, which I translated for myself as impossible. Or rather, it doesn't happen. I replied with a single word. It happens. He looked at it some more. Then he asked slowly, "Have you seen this yourself?" I answered honestly, "I know this." It's not the same as seeing it, but it's true. Han accepted this answer after a pause that signaled he was weighing the credibility of the source against the novelty of the information, and credibility won out. So Yinj listened to this conversation and came to me the next morning with a question that showed she'd been thinking about it all night. She asked, "If seeds produce more seeds, why do the spirits send famine?" It wasn't a theological question. It was a practical question from someone who had just realized that the world works differently than she'd been told, and was now reevaluating everything she knew. I answered slowly and carefully because the answer had significance beyond the conversation. I said, "The spirits don't send famine. Famine comes when there isn't enough knowledge. Knowledge exists. It just needs to be applied." She stared at the fire for a long time after that and said nothing. And I didn't rush her, because some thoughts require time to settle into a new place without resistance. Preparing for farming in winter meant one specific action that could be started immediately. Tools. A hoe. Primitive. A flat stone tied to a handle at an angle of about 45 degrees, enough to break up the topsoil and mix it before sowing. I spent 3 days by the fire making preparations and teaching Lee and 2 teenagers the basic principle of shaping flat stones to the desired profile. Shaping a hoe stone differed from shaping an arrowhead. A sharp edge isn't needed. A flat, wide working surface with sufficient thickness to withstand the impact against frozen ground without chipping. Lee mastered this in a day, and his sling stone was better than mine because he had already learned to listen to the stone through the impact and knew when to stop before an extra chip went the wrong way. By the end of the 3rd day, we had 5 hoe stones and 5 ash handles tied with sinew using a diagonal wrap, which I had used for arrowheads and which held better than a straight wrap. Then I thought about the field. The site for the first field required 4 conditions simultaneously: a south-facing slope for maximum light, proximity to water for irrigation during dry periods, far enough from trees so that roots wouldn't compete with the crops, close enough to camp to protect against animals and birds. I described these conditions to Khan and asked him to think of places he knew. He thought about it for a day. The next morning he came to me and said he knew of such a place. He described it. I sketched a diagram on a stone based on his description, and he corrected it twice before nodding. The spot was about 300 meters southeast of the camp. A gentle slope, a stream 20 meters away, the edge of the forest behind us, an open space about 30 meters across, enough for the first planting. Not much, just enough to learn from a small mistake rather than a big one. So he heard our conversation, came over, and asked when. I answered, "When the snow melts from this slope first. The south-facing slope thaws before the rest. As soon as the ground thaws to a depth of a handspan, we can start." So nodded. Then he asked one more thing. "Who will do it?" I answered without a pause. "Everyone who wants to eat bread in 2 seasons." So didn't answer right away. He thought, with an expression that meant he was calculating the organization of people and resources just as he calculated a hunt. Then he nodded once, briefly. That meant he was taking charge of the organization. I didn't object. I never objected when So took charge of organizing people because he did it better than I did, knowing every member of the tribe as well as one knows those with whom one has lived all one's life. Chon Su-ah joined our conversation at the end and said one sentence that I understood completely. She said, "My mother said that her mother put seeds in the ground by the river, and they grew." I paused. This was important. It meant that the memory of farming existed in this tribe, not the practice, the memory of a practice that had been forgotten for a generation or two. I asked Chon Su-ah slowly and precisely, "Did your mother remember exactly what her mother did with the seeds?" Chon Su-ah thought. Then she said a few words. "She soaked them in water first. Then she placed them in the ground by the water. Then she covered them with soil and left them alone. Soaking the seeds before sowing to speed up germination. Sowing by the water for constant moisture. Minimal interference after sowing so as not to damage the sprouts. It was the right technique. Not complete, but fundamentally correct. I smiled, and Chong Sua saw that smile, and something changed in her face. Not pride, something quieter. Something like the feeling when knowledge you've carried within you for a long time and considered useless turns out to be necessary. I said one sentence to her in their language. Your mother knew correctly. We will do what she knew. Jung Sua didn't answer. She nodded and went back to her place by the fire, and I saw her say something quietly to the woman next to her, who listened and nodded as well. Knowledge is passed from mother to daughter, lost and found again. It was neither a tragedy nor a victory. It was simply how the memory of humanity works without writing. Unstable, fragmentary, but not completely, never completely. By the end of winter, we had 5 hoes, a specific spot for the first field, 3 types of wild crops that Han had marked on a stone, a map, and which we would search for as soon as the snow began to recede. And there was Chong Sua, who carried in her memory a sewing technique that I could have read in a book, but which, in her words, meant something else. It meant that these people were already moving toward agriculture on their own, slowly, through the memory of their mothers, without a system, but they were moving. I merely gave that movement direction and speed. Outside, winter was beginning to change. Not yet spring, but no longer the middle of winter. Something in the light had grown a little longer and a little softer, and Han was the first to notice it and said one word: soon. I smiled quietly into the darkness because soon didn't just mean the end of winter. Soon meant the beginning of the first season in this tribe's history when food would grow where they decided it should grow. They thought I was preparing them for spring. They didn't know that I was preparing them for the moment when the concept of hunger would become a story they tell their children by the fire, rather than a reality they endure every winter. The snow began to recede from the southern slope on the 42nd day of winter, and I knew it was the southern slope because Khan had shown me the directions of the light back at the start of winter through the sun and shadows and the positions of certain stars at night. The strip of exposed earth was about a meter wide along the warmest edge of the slope, and the earth beneath it was dark and damp and smelled the way earth only smells after a long snowfall. Sharp, alive, as if something had awakened inside and was breathing. I took a handful of that earth and crumbled it between my fingers, loose, not frozen in the top layer. Enough. Khan stood nearby, and I hadn't called him. He'd come on his own because over the winter he'd learned to sense when I was going to look at something important. He took the soil from my hand and kneaded it too. Then he said one word, his word for ready. We returned to camp, and I found So and said 3 words to him. Tomorrow, field. That's it. So nodded, and in the evening he spoke with the people for a long time, and I listened and understood about 80%, and that was enough to know that he was explaining correctly and adding on his own what I hadn't said and what needed to be said. He spoke about how the field isn't work for the sake of work. He spoke about how the field is next year's winter, which won't be like this one. He spoke in words I couldn't find in their language, because they were the words of a man who had lived here all his life and knew what the word winter meant to these people. In the morning, everyone who could hold a hoe went out. 22 people, not counting children and the elderly. Khan went too, though I hadn't expected it and hadn't asked. The field looked different without snow than I had imagined from Khan's description. Larger. The south-facing slope was about 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, if you counted only the part where there were no rocks larger than a fist. About 800 square meters of usable land. For the first season, I planned on a third of that, just under 300 square meters. That was enough to learn the ropes and get the first harvest, without the risk of losing everything a single mistake of scale. I divided the people into 3 groups without saying a word, because words were no longer needed for simple tasks. Lee and 4 men were assigned to clear stones from the field's working surface. Pak and 3 others were tasked with loosening the soil with hoes along the lower edge, where the ground is softest after the thaw. The rest were assigned to clear last year's grass and roots. So walked among the groups, and I didn't walk with him because that was his space. My space was at the lower edge, where I worked with a hoe alongside Pak, demonstrating the depth and angle of the strike, not with words, but with my back standing next to him. Loosening frozen soil with a hoe is hard work. Not physically impossible, just hard. Muscles don't tire immediately, but through accumulation. And a person who doesn't know this rhythm rushes ahead at the start and collapses in the middle. I worked slower than I could, not out of weakness, out of calculation. A pace that can be sustained for 6 hours is more important than one that can be sustained for just 1 hour. Park figured this out on his own after an hour, without a word, because he saw that I was working steadily and getting less tired than he was, so he adjusted his pace. By noon, the bottom third of the field had been loosened to a depth of about 20 centimeters. The soil lay in upturned layers, dark and damp, with a smell that had grown stronger compared to the morning. Yinji arrived at noon with food and water, and I appreciated this as an organizational decision she had made on her own. People working without food in the middle of a hard day lose a third of their efficiency by evening. She knew this intuitively, or from experience, or from both sources at once. After eating, we continued, and by sunset, the loosened strip covered about half of the planned area. Good. We'll finish loosening the soil tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, we'll go get the seeds. Seeds were the main issue to which I had devoted the last 3 winter evenings, thinking methodically. Wild grasses produce seeds in the fall, and these seeds overwinter in the soil, on the stems, or in the stores of birds and rodents. Finding seeds on the stems in early spring before they scatter into the ground was a matter of speed and observation. Khan knew where to look. I knew what to look for. That was the right division of labor. Wild onions reproduce via bulbs, and the bulbs overwinter in the ground. They can be dug up now, and some can be planted in the field. Not all of them, just some. A third for planting, 2/3 for food, because people who are starving don't think about next season. Lentils are trickier. The seed pods overwinter on dry stalks if the birds haven't found them first. We had to check. On the second day after starting work in the field, I took Khan and Lee and we went to the edge of the forest on the eastern side, where Khan had seen lentils in the fall. The stems were dry and brittle, and most of the pods were empty. The birds had found them first. But not all the pods. At the base of the stalks, right near the ground, where the snow had lingered longer and it was difficult for the birds to reach, the pods still held seeds. We gathered them carefully and silently, and Lee worked faster than I did because he had long, nimble fingers that moved between the pods without any wasted motion. In total, about 200 grams of lentil seeds. Not much, but it's more than enough for the first sowing of a small plot. We found the grains on an open slope half a kilometer from the camp, in the spot that Khan had marked on the stone map back in winter. The stems were short and yellow, and the ears were partly empty, but partly not. We spent half a day gathering and obtained about 500 grams of grain, which So Yinji poured into a leather bag, tied it tightly, and hung it within easy reach, as if it were something important and fragile. Chon Swa dug up the wild onion bulbs herself the next morning with 2 young women and brought back about 3 kilograms. She set aside a third for planting. She gave 2/3 for food. I watched her do this and thought that she had divided it in exactly the same proportions that I considered correct. 1/3 into the ground, 2/3 into the stomach. She didn't know my calculations. She knew something else. Something from the same place where she had learned the sowing technique from her mother's mother. The instinct to preserve the seed. Not mathematics. Something deeper than mathematics. On the 4th day, we sowed. Jung Sua insisted on soaking the grains in water overnight, and I didn't object because she was right, and because to object would have meant ignoring knowledge that had worked long before I came along. The grain, swollen overnight in cold water, lay at the bottom of a birch bark bowl that So Unji had made in a single evening from a piece of birch bark and strips of sinew. I demonstrated the planting depth. 2 centimeters, no more. Any deeper, and the sprout won't break through the cold earth. Any shallower, and the birds will find it. The distance between rows was about 20 centimeters. The distance between seeds in a row was about 10. It wasn't an exact science. It was a reasonable approximation for the first season. Chon Sua sowed the first row herself, and I followed behind, covering the seeds with soil using the back of the hoe. Then So Eun-ji took the next row, then Lee, then two more. We worked in silence because sewing isn't the kind of task that requires words. The hands know what to do once you've shown them once, and the body has remembered. By the evening of the fourth day, the field was sown. All three crops in separate sections that I had marked off with stakes so as not to mix them up during tending. Grains at the top of the slope where it's drier, lentils in the middle, onions at the bottom edge where it's wetter. Each crop in its own place. Not because I decided so, because each of them grew wild on exactly this kind of terrain, and I simply reproduced on a small scale what nature had done on a large one. So I stood at the edge of the field when we finished and looked at the tilled earth and the boundary stakes between the sections and the even rows of seed marks. Then he said one sentence, and I understood him completely. He said, "The earth looks as if it already knows what to do." I smiled quietly, because that was more accurate than any agronomic explanation I could have given. The earth really did know. The seeds knew. The spring rain that would begin in a few days, according to all the signs I had already learned to read in this climate, knew too. All that was left for me to do was not to interfere with what already knew how to work without me. They thought they had sown grain. They didn't know they had sown something else. The idea that the earth is not just something to walk on. The earth is something you can ask and receive an answer from if you know how to ask. The first answer will come in 4 weeks, when the first sprouts appear from the ground. Until then, the field must be protected from birds and animals, watered on dry days, and waited for with the patience that distinguishes the farmer from the hunter more than any tool. The first sprouts appeared on the 26th day after sowing, and it was neither I nor Khan who found them. Me found them. The very same me who was born on the first night when I lit the fire, who was now about 4 months old, and whom mother carried tied to her chest with a leather strap as she walked around the camp. Her mother went out to the field in the morning to check that the birds hadn't pecked at the outer row where the onions were shallower than the rest, and she saw the sprouts herself and said something loudly, and me, who was looking at the world over her mother's shoulder, also looked in the direction her mother was looking. I was by the river when I heard voices and came to the field 3 minutes later to find 8 people standing there, looking at the thin green threads rising from the dark earth. Grass sprouts. Thin, about a centimeter tall. Pale green because the chlorophyll hadn't yet reached full concentration in the cold spring light. But alive. Definitely alive. And definitely a grain, not a weed, judging by the shape of the first leaf, which I knew how to distinguish. Chon Sua stood closest to the sprouts and looked at them with an expression I couldn't describe in a single word. Not surprise, not joy, something quieter and deeper, as if she were talking to someone who couldn't answer aloud. So came up last, as always. Whenever something important happened by the field, he was the last to arrive. Not because he was in no hurry, but because he looked at the people first, and only then at what they were looking at. He stopped next to me, and we stood in silence, looking at the sprouts, and I thought about how this moment was small and imperceptible from the outside, but inside it was a rupture, before this moment and after it. Before this moment, food came to them. They went after it, into the forest, to the river, to hunt. Food was out there, and they moved toward it. Now food came to them. They planted it, and it grew where they told it to grow. This is a different order of the world. Not grand, not loud, but different. So he said one sentence, not to me, to everyone standing nearby. Quietly, and without a tone of triumph, because he was a man who didn't need triumph to prove he was right, he said, "It grew." 3 words. Nothing more could have been said. I nodded and went to check the other rows. The lentils had sprouted in the middle section. 5 out of 8 rows had sprouted. 3 hadn't yet, but that was normal for cold spring soil. The onions hadn't sprouted yet, but I checked the bulbs in the ground by gently prying up the edge with my finger. Alive, swollen, getting ready, just slower than the grain. Protecting the field from birds was the next task I had to tackle immediately because the sprouts were visible and the birds would find them today or tomorrow. Rattles. The simplest method that worked everywhere I'd read about early agriculture. A few bones or pebbles in a leather pouch tied to a thin rope stretched across the field. The wind sways it. The rattle rattles. The birds don't land. I explained it to Lee in 5 minutes, and he left and returned an hour later with 4 rattles made from bird bones and pieces of sinew, about 10 meters long each. We stretched the sinew across the field in a crisscross pattern over stakes along the perimeter and tied the rattles evenly. The very first gust of wind from the river set the whole system in motion, and a dry, bone-like clatter rang out clearly over the field. One of the teenagers burst out laughing. Not at the rattles. At a crow flying toward the field that suddenly veered off in midair with that frantic flapping of wings that happens only when startled unexpectedly. It works. Lee looked at the system of rattles with the expression of someone memorizing the design so he could make it better next time. I already knew that look. A hunt was underway parallel to the field. The first spring hunt after a long winter required a different approach than the autumn one, because the animals, after winter, were lean and fast and wary in a different way than in the fall when they grew fat and slowed down. Lee conducted reconnaissance for 3 days in a row before dawn, returning for breakfast with a report he now delivered in their language using coherent sentences, because over the winter he had begun to speak noticeably more and more accurately. On the 3rd day, he found a deer trail by a stream 2 kilometers to the north. Fresh tracks. A female with 2 young. The leader was following the trail separately to the east. I listened to his report and asked one thing. Where is the position for a shot without a drive? Lee described the spot. I pictured it. Good. The deer walks along the stream to the watering hole in the morning. The trail runs between 2 large rocks. At this spot, the animal slows down because the rocks narrow the space and its instinct for caution takes over. It was an ambush without a drive. 1 man, 1 shot. No noise, no shouting, no second attempt. I asked Lee, "You can take it yourself." He looked at me for a second, not out of uncertainty. He was checking to see if he'd understood the question correctly. Then he answered with a single word. Yes. He left the next morning while it was still dark, with a bow and 6 arrows and a leather water bag. Alone. Unaccompanied. His first solo hunt. Pak wanted to go with him, and I said no through So, because So accepted it without explanation, understanding that a solo ambush requires silence that 2 people cannot maintain as well as 1. Lee returned in the middle of the day with venison on his shoulders. A female, about 90 kilograms. A shot behind the shoulder from 20 meters. Clean. 1 arrow. He laid the kill at So's feet and said a short phrase that I understood completely. He said, "She went where you said she would go." He was addressing me. I replied with a single sentence in their language that came out grammatically correct the first time, without any mistakes. I said, "Now you know this yourself, and you don't need me to say it." Lee looked at me with the expression I'd once seen on the face of a man who'd been given a fishing rod instead of a fish and had just realized it. So Yinj took the cutting board, and while she worked, I sat at the edge of the field, looking at the sprouts and the system of rattles above them, and listening to So talk with Pak about the next hunt, and how Pak suggested a spot he'd found himself. Pak suggested. So listened. This was the new order of things. A month ago, So received information only from Han and from me. Now Pak was suggesting, and So regarded it as normal. I closed my eyes and listened to the camp, the rattles above the field, the conversation between So and Pak, the sound of stone against bone from Lee, who was sharpening a new spearhead, the voice of Jiang Sua, who was explaining to a young woman by the fire. 4 separate sources of knowledge operating simultaneously without my involvement. A month ago, there were none. I smiled with my eyes closed because no one was watching, and I could afford a smile that didn't imply calculation or carry a signal. Just a smile. A tribe that didn't know how to store food was now counting its supplies. A tribe that used to hunt by chance was now hunting systematically. A tribe that used to wait for spring was now preparing it themselves. They didn't yet know the word civilization, but they were already building it, with their hands, every day, one step at a time. And the sprouts in the ground that had risen from the seeds they had sown themselves were the most accurate symbol of this of all the ones I could think of. Because sprouts don't know they're the first. They just grow toward the light. The rain stopped on the 8th day after the sprouts appeared, and the sky became clear and cold, and the sprouts stretched upward faster because the sun now reached them unobstructed. This was good for growth and bad for moisture, because the top layer of soil began to dry out by the end of the second sunny day, and I could tell by the way the earth changed color from dark to light right at the surface. Watering. The next task, which looked simple but wasn't, because a stream 20 meters from the field is one thing, but carrying enough water for 300 square meters is another. I did the math. 1 square meter of soil in dry weather requires about 10 liters of water per week to maintain sufficient moisture at the planting depth. 300 square meters is 3,000 liters a week, about 430 liters a day. We didn't have containers for that much water. There was one birch bark bowl from Soyinji. There were a few leather bags. There was a hollowed-out hoof that was used as a dipper. The total volume carried in a single trip from the stream to the field did not exceed 20 liters, even with everyone working at the same time. 430 liters is 22 trips. With a distance of 20 meters and each trip taking about 3 minutes, that's about an hour of work per day with everyone available. An hour a day isn't a disaster, but 22 trips with awkward containers across rough terrain is physical strain that builds up and becomes a problem after a week when people start making fewer trips because they're tired and don't say anything about it. I needed a trough, or a ditch, or something that carries water on its own without human trips. A ditch was the more obvious and quicker solution. Dig a ditch from the stream to the field, about 20 meters long, with a slight slope toward the field, and the water will flow on its own under the force of gravity, which was at work long before humans even invented the word gravity. I examined the terrain between the stream and the field the next morning for the first time with the precision required for engineering solutions, rather than just general orientation. The terrain was almost perfect. The stream was 1/2 meter higher than the lower edge of the field along the natural contour. This was enough for gravity flow with a ditch slope of about 2 centimeters per meter, which provided a flow rate sufficient for irrigation without eroding the soil. I found Lee and explained the idea in 10 minutes using a sketch on the ground and a few words. He listened and then asked one thing. How wide should we dig? Good question. Is it necessary? Is it possible? How wide? He was already thinking about the execution. I gestured with my fingers. About 20 centimeters wide, the same depth. That's enough for the required flow volume. Lee took a hoe and called Pak and 2 other men, and they began digging from the stream toward the field while I marked the line with stakes every 2 meters so the ditch would run straight and not meander or lose its slope. The work took 1/2 a day. The soil was soft after the spring rains, and the hoes cut through it easily. By noon, the ditch was ready along its entire length, from the stream to the lower edge of the field. I removed a piece of bark that was temporarily blocking the entrance to the ditch at the stream, and the water began to flow. Slowly at first, then more steadily, then at a steady flow of about 1 liter per minute, which ran along the bottom of the ditch quietly and without human effort. Lee stood at the ditch's exit by the field and watched as the water flowed out to the lower edge of the sown land and spread in slow, dark tongues between the rows. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said one word, quietly, a word that meant, in their language, something between clever and right and good all at once. Pak looked at the ditch and the field and then asked me directly, without going through So, which was new because before he had always gone through So. He asked, "Can we do the same thing for the camp, so we don't have to walk to the stream for drinking water?" I looked at him for a second. Then I smiled. Not because the question was funny, but because it was the right thing to ask, and it came from a man who had applied a principle from one task to another on his own, without prompting. I answered with a single word. Yes. So Yinjie, who had overheard the conversation, approached and said without preamble, "Then let's do the camp first. The field can wait a day. People drink every day." I looked at her. She was right about the priority. The field with the ditch was already working. Drinking water is more important than the convenience of irrigation. We dug the second ditch the next day. In short, about 10 meters from the stream to the edge of the camp, with a small depression at the end that I carved out of the rock outcrop by the shore as a primitive reservoir. The reservoir filled up in 2 hours and held the water because the rock is impermeable. Chon Sua came to the reservoir, scooped up some water with a birch bark cup, drank it, and said something to the young woman next to her, whose name I didn't know yet. Then that young woman scooped up some water and drank it, and they both watched the water flowing over the stone into the reservoir in a thin, unbroken stream. I heard part of their conversation. They were saying that the water would always be here now. No need to go to the stream in the rain. No need to go out in the dark. The water is here. A small thing, a huge difference in the lives of people who used to carry water on foot every day. Khan came to the reservoir in the evening and watched for a long time as the water flowed over the stone and filled the hollow. Then he said one long sentence that I understood almost completely. He said, "I have seen 70 winters and never thought it was possible to make water go where you need it to go, rather than where it wants to go on its own." I answered him in their language with a single sentence. Water doesn't want anything. It always goes down. We just show it where down is. The Khan looked at me. Then he looked at the water. Then he uttered the word he had used to name me. So on the very first day, the one who knows. But he said it differently, not as a form of address, as if he were weighing the word anew and finding that it had grown heavier than it was before. That evening by the fire, I thought about the next step, and the next step was both obvious and difficult at the same time.